Greetings everyone, Brett here with Hammerhead Model Making, and welcome to the first episode in a multi-part series that I'm going to be doing on the infamous Ye Olde Pub incident. If you're not familiar with this story, over the course of the next few episodes, I'm going to parse out the details and give you an idea of what transpired here. And this is a kit this is a project that I have been passionate about doing ever since I first heard the story about 3 years ago. And I've spent the last 3 years researching, preparing, gathering all the materials and the things that I would need for this project. And it's going to be an ambitious project. And my very first intention was to do this project in 1/72nd scale. But as I was doing my research and trying to figure out how I wanted to represent this moment in time, I realized that I would need to do this in a larger scale. That kind of left me with two options. I could do it in 1/48 scale or I could do it in 1/32nd scale. I settled on 1/48 scale as a good medium between size and detail, but also knowing the fact that this was going to take up a lot of space when it was done. So yeah, I'm so thrilled to be able to begin this series and show this off for you. And so this episode is going to cover the construction and painting of Franz Stigler's BF-109 G6. And so this episode will largely feel like a normal full build video, as I'll be going through that whole process for Stigler's 109. If you were paying attention to the opening credits, you'll also notice that we're going to have a guest narrator on this episode. And if you've ever watched one of my older videos, the video about the Pearl Harbor P-40, my father was a guest narrator in that episode, and he is returning for this video series. And so I'm going to concentrate on talking and narrating about the actual build itself, while my father will provide some backstory and insight into the actual incident itself. So we will hear from him a little bit later on in the video, as well as subsequent videos in this series. Now, I have a build video of this aircraft, this kit specifically, the Edward 1/48 scale BF-109 G6, and so if you've seen that video, you're going to see some things in here that are familiar, but what I'm really hoping that you'll take away from this video is the kind of zeroing in on the aspect of what I'm trying to create here is a very specific moment in time, as opposed to just a normal build where I'm building an aircraft, a vehicle, or whatever, in kind of like a vacuum, as it were. And so my vision for this project was to portray both aircraft. So there's two aircraft in this display. There's Franz Stigler's BF-109 here, and then there's going to be Charlie Brown's B-17. And there's a very specific moment in time where they were flying in formation together. And that's the moment that I wanted to capture. And in order to achieve my vision of that moment, one of the very important things specifically to this particular build is capturing the pilot, Franz Stigler, in a very specific moment. So I'm using a combination of figures from other kits, and I'm sure people who are very savvy and very knowledgeable about German uniforms will quickly notice that I am not using a German figure. I had surprisingly a difficult time trying to find a seated German BF-109 pilot. And so I decided, since the BF-109 cockpit is so small and cramped, that once I get the figure in there and I get everything closed up and I get the canopy on, you're really not going to see a whole lot of the actual figure himself. So I'm using a combination of a British fighter pilot and parts from an American fighter pilot, as well as some resin hands, because I wanted to get some very specific gestures with the hand. So the beginning portion of this video has seen me modifying a figure to be able to sit in the cockpit and look and feel like they're sitting in there naturally. And you'll notice earlier in the video that I had to kind of do a little bit of surgery on the figure in order to get them to fit in correctly. Right now, I have the arms I've left off because I want to get the figure situated in the cockpit, so that then I can start manipulating the arms and get them into the positions and poses that I want. I also used a head from a different figure, as to me, it looked better and more closely resembled something like a German fighter pilot would be wearing. And then I was able to position it in a way that, for the overall project, is the Franz Stigler will be looking out the left side of his cockpit towards where the B-17 is going to be, and he's going to be making some gestures at it. And there's a couple of moments in the story where he's trying to get the attention of the B-17 crew, and so that's roughly what I'm trying to go for here. And one of the tricky parts here was making sure that I could get his left arm, so he's going to be trying to get the attention of the B-17 with his right arm. So with his left arm, I needed him holding the control stick of the aircraft. And so it was a little back and forth trying to get the pose right, trying to get the angles right, and modifying the figures. For assembling this figure, I am using the UV curing resin. That's why you see that UV light that I keep putting on there. I'm not using super glue. I'm not using plastic cement. The reason why I'm using the UV curing glue, or not, it's technically not glue, it's just resin, is because I could quickly affix it, but if I needed to change something, it was relatively easy to pop off, clean off the resin, and then start over without damaging the plastic at all. And it was an easy way to prototype and figure out how I wanted this to fit. Now, another consideration is, because the canopy does sit pretty low, I had to make sure his hand wasn't going to hit the top of the canopy and, somehow get in the way. So it took a little while, but I was finally pleased with how the figure fit in the cockpit and how he was looking and how natural it was and how much you'd be able to see of him from the exterior of the aircraft. Now, this kit is one of their white box kits. It's known as an Overtree kit. So if you're not familiar with an Eduard Overtree kit, it is essentially just a plain box with just plastic in it. It doesn't come with decals. It doesn't come with instructions. It doesn't come with photo etch, masks, anything. It just comes with the plastic. And it comes at a considerable discount compared to like a Profi pack or even a weekend edition of the kit. And the idea is you go out and purchase one of the Eduard Profi packs, for example, and they usually come with 6 to 10 different paint schemes. And so the idea is you buy a Profi pack and then you buy a couple of Overtree sets so that you can use some of those extra decals that you get. And obviously you would need to use the instructions from the original Profi pack, things like that. Fortunately, I do have a couple of the 109 kits in my stash, and so having instructions was not an issue. Additionally, because I am using aftermarket decals and paint masks for markings, I didn't need to worry about decals, and because I was doing the pilot inside the aircraft, I wasn't worried about like not having the photo etch instrument panel, things like that, just because I knew they would just never be seen. Same thing with like photo etch seat belts, for example. I'm just making my own here using some lead foil and wire so that I can have the restraints over the shoulder of the pilot. So, for instances like this, an Overtree's kit is actually really nice and really handy. I mean, I would say 60%, reduced price from a normal Profi pack. So in my mind, it's a pretty good value. So if you buy like a Profi pack and then you can pretty much buy 2 sets of Overtrees and then maybe a set of masks if you wanted to for the same price of a Profi pack. And so in my mind, it makes sense. I think it's a good way of utilizing all the great marking schemes that Edward usually gives you in their Profi packs. So right now I'm just attaching the harnesses, the scratch built harnesses that I made using some super glue. Attach it to the back deck of the cockpit there, and then I'll drape them over the pilot. I'm not too worried about doing like the lap belts, making sure they're all connected. Again, mainly just because I know that you'll never really be able to see in there. And just trying to guide the lead foil around. The nice thing about the lead foil is it does fold and drape quite naturally, considering the scale, and it makes for good seat belts, things like that. And another thing I should point out about this video is I built this aircraft about 7 months ago from the time of the release of this video. And so there's a lot of things that I didn't have when I built this that I'd have now. For example, if you've seen the recent F9F Panther video, I show off a product in there called Black Magic Metal. I didn't have that at the time that I did the 109, but in later episodes of this series, when I'm working on the B-17, you'll see that make an appearance. And that's just mainly because there's quite a large time difference between when I started this versus when I worked on and finished the B-17. Now, for painting the 109, I am using this Vallejo German aircraft paint set, which comes with a lot of the standard RLM colors, and makes it easy just to this is Stigler's 109 was a fairly prototypical BF-109 paint scheme for 1943, so nothing like extraordinarily out of the norm for this. Using interior gray here to paint all of the obviously interior of the cockpit, and over a primer of Mr. Surfer 1500 black. Goes down really nice, goes down really easy. Now we're just going to do a simple dry brush. I'm not going to go overboard on all the details for this interior. Again, for the same reasons that all the other things, just because I know you're never going to really see any of it. Once the pilot's in there and the fuselage is closed up, you really don't see much below like the neck of the pilot. But doing a nice, stark dry brush will help any of those details that might be visible to kind of pop and stand out. The whole interior gets this dry brush, and including the pilot figure, because what it helps at least for me, what it helps with is seeing the details and finding the details in the figure, especially on like a solid matte black primer. It just makes it a little bit easier during the painting process. This is the fuel line that goes along the side of the cockpit here. We're going to paint some of the smaller details. Again, we're just using some Vallejo model color brush paints here to do our detail painting. And now normally on like the Profi Pack version of this kit, you'd have a lot of nice photo etch going into here, pre-color photo etch and things like that. But that's all largely hidden in the cockpit. I will be using the decal to do the instrument panel, and though I didn't have a lot of aspirations for it, it actually turns out pretty decent, I think, in my opinion. You'll see that just a little bit later on. I do like the use of color in the German cockpits. They had a tendency to color code various things like blue for oxygen, things like that, and it does help break up all of that just kind of drab gray color. Now we're going to move on to the pilot. I struggled finding good reference pictures of what like your prototypical 1943 German flight suit would look like. I found a few different pictures, so I'm sure there's going to be people out there that are going to tell me like, no, that's not quite right, and that's fair. But in the end, I kind of liked the way it looked, and I liked the idea of like the brown leather flying jacket and the blue uniform underneath, things like that. It just kind of worked for me, and so I'm definitely not a figure painter. So my figure painting skills here are going to be pretty rudimentary. Essentially, it's going to consist of, blocking in all of the solid colors and then doing a pretty heavy like wash over that to kind of pick out some of the details, and then maybe a little bit of slight dry brushing after the fact just to hit some of those highlights again. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple, nothing spectacular. But again, once it's all closed up, all you're going to really see is like his head, the top of his shoulders, and his hand, and that's about it. So I don't need it to look anything much more than that. Getting the leather helmet painted. Now we're going to do the belts, the seat belts here. Get those painted in kind of like a light gray color, which is nice because it helps kind of stand out against the uniform. So, yep, this is one of those things where like I enjoy the process, even though it's definitely not like my favorite thing to do. Figure painting is still a struggle for me, and even though I try to go and watch videos on YouTube about how the best way to and easiest way to do figure painting, it's still just something that I struggle to really grasp and feel confident about. So here's that wash I was telling you about. This is just the Citadel Agrax Earth Shade wash. It works for me. Getting the fuel line installed here. Again, I like the splash of color in the cockpit. And here's the instrument panel I was telling you about. So I did give it a quick dry brush. Now I'm going to apply some Solvaset onto the part, and then I will apply the decal on top of that. The Solvaset is a pretty strong decal setting solution, and I've started applying it underneath the decal as kind of like a setting solution, or like a microsol and microset. I apply one before and then after. In this case, I just do the same thing before and after. But I found it helps with adhesion and really getting it to sink down into those around those details. So now we can kind of start dry fitting things in the cockpit, see how they look. The again, like I said, really tight in here, but definitely to me, it works and it looks the part. And it was really fun at this point, like getting it all painted, starting to get the fuselage put together, and having this moment where like the finished project flashed before my eyes, and it was like, okay, I'm on the right path. This is the direction that I'm going, the direction that I want to go, and it was an exciting moment, and I love when I'm working on a project. And I have that moment where I can see the end result in my mind's eye, and know that I'm on the right track. That's always a fun moment. And I have that a few times throughout this project where I get that flash where it's like, okay, I'm liking where this is going. It's working, and I'm excited to see it. Because one of the fun things for me is I'll get to a point where I'm excited to see what happens next as I'm doing it. And it's kind of a fun feeling to get that, where like I get to actually be excited about whatever project I'm working on. And this is definitely one of those times, and I have it multiple times throughout this series. So right now I'm just getting the gun sight painted up so that we can get that installed, and we'll be able to work on closing up the fuselage and stuff. So here's the instrument panel again. I'm going to use a little bit of the UV curing resin on each of the dials just to kind of provide a nice little shiny face there. It's a fun little process that I like doing, and I like the look of it once it gets fit in there. It's interesting that like you fit the cockpit onto one side of the fuselage, you fit the instrument panel on the other side of the fuselage, but Edward's done a good job with the engineering in it, and it fits pretty nicely. So there you can see just how tight it is in there. So moving on, we are going to take the fuselage, and we're going to start building it up and putting it together. Again, fit here on this kit. This is a phenomenal kit. It goes together really well. It's actually overall quite simple. You don't have a lot of options for this kit. Like the Tamiya BF109 G6, you can do like the engine open, closed. You can position the flaps, control surfaces, all those things. This kit has slightly fewer options, but that kind of helps make it build up a little bit faster and easier, in my opinion, and give you a nice, good result. So fuselage goes together. You can see I've got the tape there kind of holding everything together. There was a slight little bit of warpage on the front part of it, and I had to, really squeeze those together, but nothing that a little bit of tape couldn't overcome. Get the very front on here installed. You also notice that I pre-installed the exhaust earlier in the video. I just figured it'd be easier just to get those installed. I mean, you're supposed to install them at the beginning anyways, but worry about, painting those up later. And I'm just using the kit part there. There's no resin or anything in there, so they're not drilled out or anything. But honestly, I find that unless you're like really specifically looking for the drilled out exhaust, you're not really going to notice, because they kind of sit under these little shrouds that help direct the actual exhaust coming out. So that it's not like blowing up into the air intake or into the into the pilot's view, that kind of a thing. So you don't really see it all that well. So at this point, I am working on taking care of the seam lines, and fortunately, because of the engineering, there's really not a lot that you have to worry about. It's really around the nose, and that's kind of it. Because if you look at the way that Messerschmitt designed and built the 109s, and I believe this also works for the 110s as well, is they actually do, on the real aircraft, they do have a very small seam line running along the top and bottom of the back fuselage or the spine. And so it's correct to have a seam line up there. Now, you don't want to necessarily just leave just the two halves glued together and call that good. You do still have to do a little bit of sanding on the top of the spine to make sure that it's even and flush left to right, that kind of a thing. So it does require a little bit of work, but at least you don't have to worry about like completely removing that seam line altogether. Now, with all the sanding done and rescribing done, we're going to go ahead and re-rivet some of the areas that we sanded away the detail on, using this Galaxy riveting tool and the 0.65 wheel. Pretty much spot on match for the rivets already engraved on the kit itself. So it's pretty easy just to kind of line this up and apply a little bit of pressure and get those rivets restored. And again, there's not a lot of areas where we have to do the rivet restore. It's really just around those seam areas where we cleaned up the seams earlier on. So now we can begin installing a lot of the other extra bits and panels and details for the aircraft. We have this gun panel going on. Now, depending on, there's a lot of sub-variants of the Gustav series of 109s, and so there's different like gun panels, things like that you can, depending on which version you're doing, you'll need to pick the appropriate one. Again, as far as I understand, this was a fairly standard G6. As such, it has the openings for the two machine guns over the cowling. Getting the intake installed here, and that's a two-part affair. Get the upper tail on, get that installed, and I do like the little detail of this little strip here. So I guess this is part of the mechanism that helps like the engine covers hinge up. Just kind of a neat little detail that they have that separate. Moving on to the wings, we get all of the interior, of the landing gear installed. I do appreciate that these are all kind of separate parts. I think it helps with the detail a little bit more than just having it like molded in and simplifying the detail. With Eduard kits, they are designed to have the landing gear down. So you have to make modifications in order to portray the landing gear up, and especially on an aircraft like this where it's not just as simple as just closing over the hole with a door, because the landing gear door on the 109 only partially covers the wheel. It doesn't fully cover the wheel, so you do have to make sure that you have at least some of that detail that will be visible in there. But additionally, like you'll see in a little while what I mean, that there is additional modifications that will need to be made in order to get the landing gear to actually fit up inside the wing. Again, because it's not really designed for that, which is unfortunate, but I get it. Like, many people build their planes on the ground. And I'm finding myself now actually brainstorming more and more projects of in-flight aircraft. I mean, if you think about it, like, that's what they're meant to do. They're meant to be flying. So, who knows? I might be doing more of this in the future, more in-flight type displays. So now we can go ahead and get the upper wings installed. And again, a nice thing about these is the seam lines are kept to a minimum. And so there's not a ton of cleanup work that will have to be done, just a little bit on the front end, basically. We can go ahead and work on the horizontal stabilizers. These are two pieces. On many other kits, you might see those just as a single piece. Edward has chosen to do them as a two-part. But because of the fit, you really don't even need to worry about it all that much. They actually go together quite nicely. Get the elevators installed. These have a really short tab that kind of slots into the back of the horizontal stabilizer. So if you really wanted to, you could add a little bit of deflection to these without any modification. But all right, so here we're going to do the landing gear, and you can see here that the actual landing gear door doesn't fully sit down into the wheel well properly. So we're going to have to make some modifications, and that's basically just going to involve sanding away some of the material on the outside edges, which will allow it to sit into that wheel well a little bit better. And so I'm just using this jeweler's file to file away some of that, just a little bit of structure there, and that lets it sit in there much better, much more flush. Additionally, the tire is too thick to actually fully sit in the wheel well, so I had to thin that down almost by half in order to get that to sit in the wheel well properly. And there we go. We can get that in there. Now, in reality, there would be a strut attached to that wheel, which would also be attached to the landing gear door. Just for the sake of actually being able to make this fit, I omit the actual strut itself. So you just see the tire, you see the door over it. Technically not correct, but, in the interest of making it work and not have to thin that tire down to like 2 millimeter thickness, this was the better solution in my opinion. Also, not to mention that for the final display, you're not going to be really looking directly up underneath the aircraft to even notice. So compromises, but I think they make sense. All right, moving back to the fuselage, we're going to do the radiator underneath the engine here. Nice little multi-part piece going on. I do appreciate the way that this part fits in there so that you don't actually have to worry about sanding seams along that radiator part, which on older models is a pretty common thing and really annoying. So in just a few moments, I'm going to switch narration over to my father. And before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of backstory on this project. I first found out about this project 3 years ago, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and purchased the book A Higher Call by Adam Makos. And his book and his narration and his style of storytelling is really what has provided the biggest source of inspiration for this project. And I asked my father to read the book and essentially give me his thoughts and in his words a summary of who these people were, Franz, Stigler, Charlie Brown, and what happened. So his segment here is going to be talking about Franz Stigler and who he was and all the things, the events that led up in his life to this moment.
When most people hear the name Franz Stigler, they think of the remarkable story from December 1943, a German fighter ace who, instead of destroying a helpless American B-17 bomber, escorted it out of danger. It was one of the most extraordinary acts of mercy in the history of warfare. But if we stop the story there, we miss the deeper question, why? Why did Franz Stigler make that choice? What is in his life and character that led him, in the middle of the Second World War, to spare the lives of enemy airmen at great risk to himself? To answer that, we need to go back before the war, before the fateful day over Germany, to Franz Stigler's upbringing and his early life. Franz was born in 1915 in Rosenberg, Germany. He grew up in a devout Catholic family, raised with a strong sense of right and wrong. His father, a man both of faith and engineering skill, introduced Franz and his brothers to aviation at a time when flying still seemed miraculous. The Stiglers were not Nazis. This is an important point. Unlike many families in Germany who joined the party either out of enthusiasm or simply to gain social standing, the Stiglers quietly resisted. They never took the oath, never put the Nazi banner on their house. That decision came with risks. To refuse membership in the Nazi Party was to stand apart, to invite suspicion. But Franz's family lived by conscience, not by ideology. That integrity would mark Franz's path as well. Franz's passion from an early age was flight. He studied aviation not as a weapon of war, but as a craft. By the late 1930s, before the war began, he was working as a flight instructor for Lufthansa and the German Air Transport School. He trained civilian pilots. He loved the discipline of the air, navigation, engine mechanics, the skill of smooth takeoff and landings. When war broke out, Franz did not immediately rush to the front. In fact, he preferred flying in the civilian sphere. But like most trained aviators in Germany, he was drawn into the Luftwaffe. The war did not give him much choice. At first, Franz's work was not as a combat ace, but as an instructor for fighter pilots. His students would go on to fly the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the backbone of Germany's fighter force. But soon the demand for skilled pilots grew too great, and Franz himself was transferred into combat. He flew in North Africa, a campaign that tested pilots in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. He served under Hans Joachim Marcel, one of the most famous aces in the Luftwaffe. Marcel was extraordinary, not only for his flying skill, but for his character. He treated captured Allied pilots with respect and refused to let his men fire on parachuting enemies. To Marcel, the combat was the skill, not a cruelty. This philosophy left a deep impression on Franz. He began to see aerial combat not as a personal hatred of the enemy, but as a grim duty, something bound by rules of honor. Franz became an effective fighter pilot. He learned the brutal realities of war, dogfights that lasted seconds, friends who did not return from missions, the strain of constant danger. He scored victories in the sky, but he never revealed them. For Franz, every battle was a matter of survival, not triumph. By 1943, Franz had become a seasoned veteran. He was credited with dozens of kills, had faced the British and American pilots alike, and had seen the scale of destruction the war was unleashing on both sides. Germany by then was on the defensive, hammered by Allied bombing campaigns. The pressure on the Luftwaffe pilots was immense, shooting down bombers at all costs. But Stigler did not become hardened in the way that many of his peers did. The lessons of his upbringing, his family's quiet resistance to Nazism, his love of aviation, and his time under honorable leaders like Marcel shaped his conscience. It is important to remember that at this point in the war, the Nazi regime demanded not only obedience, but also ideological loyalty. Luftwaffe pilots were rewarded with medals, honors, and prestige for high kill counts, many celebrated as heroes of the Reich. But Franz never joined the Nazi Party. He never saw himself as fighting for Hitler's ideology. He was fighting because his country was at war, because his fellow pilots were in the air with him, because not flying was not an option. He often said later in life that he was not motivated by politics, but by duty and the bounds of comradeship. That made him unusual. In a system that demanded conformity, Franz carried a sense of independence. He was not blind to the horrors of the regime, nor was he indifferent to the suffering around him. And although he was a fighter ace, he did not think of his adversaries as nameless enemies. To him, they were men just like himself, risking their lives in the machine of war. By late 1943, Franz Stigler was stationed back in Europe. He was at a crossroads. He had survived the deserts of North Africa. He had trained countless young pilots, many of whom never came back. He had flown against some of the best the Allies had to offer. He had been shaped by mentors who emphasized honor and mercy, not brutality. And through it all, he had carried with him his family's example of moral courage, the quiet conviction that you do what's right, not what's easy. All of that, the Catholic upbringing, the refusal to embrace Nazism, the love of aviation, the hard lessons of combat, and the influence of Marcel came together to form the man he was in December 1943. So when he took off that day and saw a battered American bomber limping through the skies, when he moved behind it and had the chance to claim an easy victory, he was not simply a Luftwaffe ace at that moment. He was Franz Stigler, the son of a principled family, the pilot who loved flying for his own sake, the man who still believed in honor. And that was his choice. Though extraordinary, was not accidental. It was the natural outcome of a life he had lived up until that point. When we tell the story of Franz Stigler, it's easy to focus on the famous encounter with the B-17. But the real lesson lies in the years before. He had not become a man of compassion in an instant. He had been preparing for that moment all his life. Through the values he learned at home, the discipline of flying, and the example of leaders who showed him that even in war, humanity must not be abandoned. Franz Stigler reminds us that character is not forged in a single act, but it is over years tested in hardship and revealed in a moment of choice.
So when I originally set out to prepare for this project, one of the things that I knew that I would really need for this project was a set of painting masks, both for the B-17 and for the 109. I wanted to ensure that I could do the markings as good as possible. And to that end, I reached out to Kit Mask to help me and create a set of custom masks for this project. I am extremely grateful for them for dedicating so much time and energy to this project. And I definitely am going to attribute a large portion of the success of this project to them and being willing to work with me on this. So massive shout out to them. I'm going to leave their information down below in the description of the video and a link to their website. So painting markings is not necessarily an easy endeavor. The markings for this aircraft are fairly simple and straightforward, and I knew it would be a good way to practice that skill and but at the same time prepare me for doing the markings on the B-17. And the reason why that was important to me is because I knew that I would have to create areas of damage on the B-17 that would require having a marking over the damaged area. And I knew that trying to get a decal to conform over rough and jagged plastic was at best was going to be challenging. But I knew it'd be a little bit easier to paint that. And so I figured if I was going to paint the markings on the B-17, I might as well just paint the markings on the 109 as well. So that's what led to this. And I worked back and forth with Kitmask on, what's going to be the best way to achieve that and do that. So they were extremely helpful and collaborative in that process. And I know I've mentioned Kitmask multiple times on previous videos. I've used paint mask from them in multiple videos, and so far they've never let me down. So I absolutely highly recommend checking them out. They do canopy masks, they do paint masks, they do the works. And if this sounds like a paid advertisement, it's not. I do this because I appreciate the hard work that they put into their products and the fact that they work. So, sales pitch over. Head on over to their website, check them out. Like I mentioned before, the markings for this aircraft were fairly straightforward and simple, relatively simple to do. So something like this is a good opportunity to practice painting markings. Because it might allow you to do more complex paint schemes in the future, make things a little bit easier than having to worry about decals that don't conform well or don't fill into all the nice recesses and details of your model. These ones were a little tricky because you had to paint the yellow first and then carefully place a mask inside that so you'd have the outline. Some of them came out a little off kilter, but it's one of those things where for me that's good enough and close enough. And it was extremely satisfying to remove these masks and reveal that nice yellow with the black border. Very pleased with it. So there we go, markings painted. We can go ahead and do the wing walk markings. So this is using vinyl as opposed to like the Tamiya tape style. There's a little tedious to get this installed because you had to basically pull out all the little rectangles that you'd be spraying through, but it after a little bit of time, definitely worth the effort there. And then finally there's a little like first aid symbol that goes on the back here. You could spray this, but it was easier just to kind of stipple the paint on rather than get tons of paint loaded into the airbrush, only to spray a tiny little dot plus all the extra masking that require. So just know that you can stipple paint on with a brush with great effect here. And there you go, nice little first aid symbol. There are a few decals that I do need to use for this project, mainly just some of the small like unit badges and things like that would have been a little beyond my ability to paint. So to that end, we're going to go ahead and seal in everything that we've done so far on the build with a coat of Alclad Aqua Gloss. I am thinning this with Tamiya X20A, probably about 50%. I find it just helps spray better, spray a little bit easier, and allows me to lay it down a little bit thinner than if I was just spraying it directly out of the bottle, which in my opinion is a little overly thick. So this is going to twofold seal in all of our paintwork up to this point, including all those markings. We don't want to scratch those or have those ruined in any way. But it'll also give us a good, nice foundation for applying some of the decals on here. So another thing that's nice about doing an in-flight model is you kind of have a built-in painting stand. Makes things kind of easy. So we're going to go ahead and install the victory board here. As you can see here, Franz Stigler was quite an accomplished pilot and had a fair number of victories under his belt. Many of them were bombers. So he was no stranger to what he was doing. He was very accomplished at his job. And I think that impressive victory board kind of, stands in contrast to what he ends up doing. And reminds us that he wasn't a coward. He wasn't a slouch. Like, he knew what he was doing. Interesting to note. So I'm using Kit's World decals here for these markings, and you'll note that this badge that I'm putting on, I believe this is the City of Berlin badge or coat of arms, and you'll notice there's a bear on it. And the way that Kit World has done the decal is it's mirrored, so the bear is facing forward on both decals. However, after talking to some people from Germany, that is not correct, and the bear should always be facing to the left when you're looking at the emblem. So I kind of mulled over how I was going to correct that, because I wanted to make sure that was right. That's a fairly significant emblem and badge that has meaning to people, and I wanted to do it justice. And so I realized in the end I was just going to have to hand paint it. So I painted over the original bear in white and working on repainting it facing the correct direction. Far from perfect, but at an arm's length, you almost wouldn't be able to tell. And unless you're looking at like an actual picture of it next to the repainted emblem here, it'll look all right. So what I'm doing here is I have a small picture of the actual emblem, and then I'm constantly swapping the aircraft back and forth, just making sure that I'm getting close to it and as good as I can, touching up with a little bit of white paint here just to kind of clean up some of my lines and make sure the silhouette is close to correct. So once that's all done, then we're going to go ahead and gloss over the decals, seal those in, and that'll allow us to start doing some weathering over it. And I'm really glad that I repainted that emblem. I know it's a small detail, but it's one that was important for me to get correct. So next up, we're going to use my most favoritist wash in the world, the dark brown wash for green vehicles by Ammo MIG. And we're going to apply this liberally all over the aircraft. This is going to help us to make those panel lines, rivets, details pop on the aircraft. And it's a fairly simple product to use. So I apply it over the Alclad Aqua Gloss, which is an acrylic gloss varnish. And it works really well. I have not tried it over other types of gloss varnishes like enamels or lacquers. You're definitely not going to want to apply the wash over an enamel enamel varnish, because this is an enamel wash, and you'll probably end up ruining your varnish. I have used it with Vallejo acrylic varnishes with pretty good results as well. But essentially, you apply it on, you'll let it dry, which takes about 30 minutes depending on how thickly you applied it. And then because you applied over the gloss surface, you can just wipe away all the excess wash, and it'll leave the wash deposited in the panel lines, in the rivet details, and all that lovely surface detail. But you're wiping it away from all the flat surfaces on the exterior. And this is kind of like what I consider my first weathering pass, because this helps to create some contrast on the paint scheme, bring out those details, and it's kind of a little bit of like a grimy effect. Just shows a little bit of dirt buildup, that kind of thing. And right now I'm just using Q-tips to get into some of the more hard to reach areas, some of the areas that just can't get to with the paper towel. So I use the paper towel for like 80 and 85% of the wash removal, and then do the Q-tips to really kind of hone in, clean up a lot of the stuff, and get it just right. You can also take advantage of maybe a little bit of streaking if you wanted to, using the wash, creating some general streaking along the flow of the airflow. That's up to you. I tend to remove as much as I can and do any kind of streaking later on with oils, but just to know that that is a possibility. So now we're going to knock down that shine, knock down that gloss coat with a satin coat. And this is going to be the actual final varnish for the aircraft. I will do additional weathering on top of that, but I'm not going to be doing any more varnishing after this point. This is going to be the final sheen of the aircraft. And I like using this Vallejo satin coat because it still gives a little bit of shine. That you can get some nice highlights kicking off some of the sharp edges, but it's not completely dead flat. And it's the right amount of shine, in my opinion. So at this point, we can start painting some of the smaller details like the exhaust, the gun barrels, things like that, and start doing some chipping. For this, I'm just using a little bit of essentially aluminum paint on a paintbrush and applying some very targeted chipping along the wing root area, where, the pilot would be getting on the aircraft to get in. Ground crew would be up there working on maintaining, loading, arming, that kind of thing. So you're going to get a little bit of wear and tear. At this point in the war, the 109s, the Luftwaffe would have had fairly decent supply lines, and their aircraft wouldn't have been filthy and destroyed and beat up at this point. Stigler did fly multiple 109s through his career, so this would have been a fairly new aircraft to him at this point. Going to do a little bit of sponge chipping on the leading edge of the wings, around the leading edges of the engine cowling, just very little. Do a little bit on the front of the spinner as well, and then the leading edges of the propellers. Sponge chipping is a great tool. It's pretty simple, pretty easy to do. The sponge that I'm using is basically like anytime I get a piece of aftermarket resin, it'll always come with a little bit of foam in there to help protect it in its shipping. So I just save it, hang on to it, cut it up into little rectangles, little squares, and that's what I use. For the exhaust, I'm going to do a little bit of additional painting here on it. This is just hitting it with some kind of like a rusty tone on the actual exhaust stubs, and then I'm going to give it a wash of Agrax Earthshade by Citadel. Basically the same wash that I used on the pilot. This just helps kind of add some cool brown variations to the exhaust. I really like this look, and I'll use this later on the B-17 as well to great effect. So now we're going to do a little bit of post shading. For this, I'm using a lacquer paint, and this is heavily thinned, probably 90% thinner. And you'll notice I didn't do any pre-shading on this build. When I'm doing a complex camo scheme, especially like on a German aircraft, I just find it easier to do post-shading rather than pre-shading. So here I'm just trying to, I'm not going to say randomly, but selectively darken some panel lines, some rivet lines, and help, again, add another layer of contrast and depth to the paintwork, as well as it does provide a little bit of dirt and grime and buildup around areas that you would typically find people working on, maintaining, things like that. I will also use the same paint to start doing the exhaust effect at the same very highly thinned ratio, so that I can really control how much exhaust that I'm building up and how it looks, where it's going, things like that. So it takes multiple layers, multiple coats, but that's okay. I appreciate, I'd rather have the control than, just trying to get it done in 1 or 2 passes, that kind of thing. Do a little bit of gun staining as well. He had actually been up on a mission just prior to taking off after the B-17. So decided to add a little, staining around the guns. Now we're going to add a little bit of light gray, neutral gray to the exhaust, just to help portray some of that, higher octane. Now they obviously weren't using the same as high octane as like the Allies were, for example, but it still helps to create this nice heat effect into the exhaust. I do like the 109 exhaust right there at the wing root. It's kind of a unique look and a fun place to practice. Now we're going to do a little bit of oil painting. And this is largely going to, I'm going to contain this to mostly like some streaking, some fluid leaking, hydraulic fluid, things like that around the aircraft. I'm not going to really heavily weather this aircraft, mainly because I didn't want that to be a focal point for the display. Was a super heavily weathered 109. Wanted a fairly straightforward not necessarily a clean aircraft, but a well-maintained aircraft. So overall weathering on this will be kept to a minimum. Just oil stains, oil leaks, things like that you'd typically find on a frontline aircraft, and we'll do a little bit of dirtying later on. So for this, again, we're just using the oil paint. We're just adding a tiny little dot of oil paint, and then using this wide flat brush that's loaded with thinner to pull it back, to streak it back, and create that flow along the airflow. Pretty simple, pretty effective, and fun to do. Next up, we're going to do a little bit of dry brushing and blending on the upper surfaces. Again, this is where you're going to have ground crew walking around. They're going to attract dirt and debris onto the aircraft. So just trying to blend that in. Normally, if I was doing it heavier, I would go with more of a wet blend. On this one, I'm kind of doing more of like a dry brush almost to get that blended in. Add a little bit of fluid leakage here and there, things like that. So at this point, pretty much all the weathering is done. We're going to go ahead and remove the canopy masks here, and this is always a satisfying, somewhat terrifying sometimes, but usually satisfying moment in the build. And that kind of means that we're going to start wrapping this up. So next up, we're going to work on the radio lines. And there was something I wanted to try for this. So when the radio wire is attached to the antenna and the rudder, there's a little insulator that goes on there. And I wanted to try and represent that. Now, it's going to be a little out of scale, slightly overscaled. And I'm fine with that. For me, it was something new that I wanted to try, a detail that I wanted to try adding, and ultimately I'm happy with the results. So I'm actually using some, essentially the tubing, the shrink wrap tubing that comes on your standard copper wire. I pulled the wire out and was able to thread in the radio wire around it. So now we're going to go ahead and get that attached to the mast. This is being attached with some super glue. So we're going to get that glued on, and you'll notice that I've left the insulators, in quotation marks, loose at this point. As I pull this thread tight and get it attached to the rudder, there's another wire gets attached to the fuselage here that'll eventually go up and attach to the main wire itself. And so at this point, I can get these insulators moved into position and glued in place. So it's just a matter of sliding these over, and you can see here I'm struggling to get this thing with the tweezers, and that's mainly because I was actually looking through the camera trying to do this as opposed to like looking at it directly. Made it a little challenging. Now we'll get the back one slid into place and glued, and they're not going to stay yellow. I will repaint them, but we can remove the excess wire here, and then we can get the secondary wire attached. So this is just going to get glued on as well. And the nice thing about this elastic wire is that pretty much once it's like glued on, it kind of locks in almost instantly to set. So we'll go ahead and get that trimmed. I was trying to be really careful here not to accidentally cut the main wire and have to start all over again, but you can see I got a little excess on there, so I'm using my single blade steady clippers there to try and trim that down and hopefully not cut the main wire. Another instance of I got it close enough. So there we go. All right, we're going to go ahead and finish painting a few details here. We're going to get this antenna painted here. And then we'll go ahead and paint the insulators a white color. Now, like I said, yes, they're overscale, but ultimately I'm happy with the detail. I think it helps add just a little bit extra level of realism to the overall aircraft build. Go ahead and get the pitot tube painted. This actually ended up getting knocked off during the build, so I just left it separate and installed it at the very end. Get the counterbalance weights installed onto the ailerons. This is a great little detail that one thing I was worried about is I know I'm going to have to be moving this display around because I want to take it to a couple of shows next year. And so it's one of those things that I'm kind of worried that those will easily get knocked off and lost. So I have to be mindful of that. But yeah, so we are coming to the end of this build. And if you've made it this far, I appreciate you watching. Please stay tuned for the next episodes in this series. I think it'll be worth it. And I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons for supporting this channel. I'll leave a link down below if you want to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on episode 2. Greetings everyone, Brett here with Hammerhead Model Making, and welcome to episode 2 of the Higher Call series. In this episode, we're going to be mainly concentrating on all of the interior work, scratch building, modifications, and damage to the aircraft. For this kit, I am using the HK model's B-17F, and I will be using a wide range of scratch building techniques, aftermarket, 3D printing to realize my vision here. And one of the really important aspects of this build, at least for me, was making sure that I was staying true to what happened to this aircraft. And so I'll show you a little bit later on, but using the book A Higher Call by Adam Makos as my primary reference here, since there was unfortunately no images of the damaged aircraft after this particular mission, we're going largely off of like firsthand account from the crew and from Franz Stigler as well. And so as such, what I ended up doing was reading through the book multiple times and marking down any time the book mentioned damage to the aircraft. And I ended up writing essentially a multi-page, quick reference guide of all the damage the aircraft sustained, and use that as the guide to then map out the damage on a image of a B-17, so that I could kind of start wrapping my head around what I wanted this to look like. And I was able to reference all of the mentions of damage from the book in my little quick reference guide, and kind of decide what was most important for me to display. I tried to be as accurate as possible to what was described in the book. There are some areas where it's left a little vague as to what that damage actually was, and so I was able to use some creative license to represent the damage as I'm interpreting it. So don't take this as what I'm doing is 100% hard fact. A lot of this is my interpretation of what is written, of accounts given, and it's entirely possible some of the accounts might slightly contradict, but nevertheless, this is kind of how I am interpreting it here. So you can see here, I've got the book here, and I'm highlighting in orange anytime it's any kind of damage is mentioned. The highlighting yellow is anytime a crew member is injured. And so this allowed me to really kind of map out what I wanted to portray. And what was interesting is there's a point later on in the account where Franz Stigler mentions that there was pretty much like no area of the bomber that, so right here, pretty much every foot of the bomber's metal had holes in it somewhere. And so that was kind of like my goal. Was like, okay, this was kind of the vision that I had and what I wanted to portray. So here's kind of my crude drawing based on all of the references in the book, and I've got all the page notes listed here referencing all the specific damage. And while the actual final result doesn't completely match up to my drawing here, it did serve as essentially my guide and how I wanted to do this. And so the first thing that I need to do here with the bomber, with the model, is kind of start sketching out where I want the damage. And that is to help me, because with a lot of this model, if I have to represent damage on the exterior, I have to understand what's happening on the interior portion of where that damage is going to be. That way, if I need to represent internal structure, or I need to make sure that it's lining up with accounts by the crew, that it all makes sense. And so what I'm doing here is just roughly outlining what it is that I want to accomplish, what it is I want to represent, and it's going to be my guide throughout this entire build here. And so I what I'm hoping that this episode will help you understand is just the sheer massive amount of damage this aircraft sustained, and just how incredibly crippled it was when Franz Stigler happened upon it. And so one of the first things that I wanted to start out here was the rudder. In the book, it clearly says that the majority of the rudder was shot away. Now that could mean different things, like it could physically mean that a lot of the rudder was just no longer present on the aircraft. Originally, as you can see with my pencil outlining here, I kind of interpreted that as, okay, maybe the top half of the rudder was shot away. And I eventually decided to change that up, but what I needed to do was remove the rudder from the fuselage so that I could better work on that damage and have that as a separate element. And it would just allow me a little bit more freedom. What I need to do here is do some cleanup with the removed parts, kind of remove the ridges and burrs from the plastic. And I'm using this ceramic blade and knife combo set from Steady. They had sent this out to me to review, and I figured I would use it on this project here. And long story short, for the actual knife itself, as a knife, it does what it says it does as advertised. It cuts, and it cuts really nicely. But as an actual hobby knife, I didn't find it particularly useful or, better than a standard X-Acto number 11 blade, mainly because you can't do any kind of torsion on it without it snapping. And there's a few times throughout this video you'll see that I actually snapped those ceramic blades, and eventually I just kind of gave up and just went back to the normal number 11 blade because it doesn't break like the ceramic blade does. Although I do like the actual knife handle that Steady provided, but it's really only compatible with their ceramic blade, and so it's kind of an unfortunate loss. So just in case you're ever wondering, the the nose compartment was an area that I think HK models didn't do a fantastic job with. There's some inaccuracies, and now I should point out that there are a lot of different versions and configurations of the B-17 nose, specifically the B-17F nose. It went through a lot of evolution. It went through a lot of field modification, a lot of changes. So what you're going to see, the modifications you're going to see me do here don't necessarily like reflect all B-17Fs. This was just as I narrowed down what Ye Olde Pub should look like, it allowed me to narrow down what the interior should look like. And again, there's some interpretation going on here because, again, we don't have direct photographic evidence of what this aircraft looked like. We only have, working off of what contemporaries looked like. And so for a lot of the reference images that I used, I actually went on to the website for the bomb group that the Ye Olde Pub was part of and found images of other B-17Fs from that time period and based a lot of my references on those images and what those aircraft look like. It stands to reason that they would all be relatively similar. And so to that end, there are a number of modifications that need to be made to the nose just to help elevate the detail a little bit, because one of the main points of damage that Ye Olde Pub suffered was flak hit to the nose compartment. Specifically, the plexiglass nose was heavily damaged and exposed to the air. And as such, I knew that the interior compartment was going to be a little bit more visible than normal, and so I just wanted to make sure that I was representing the detail as best as possible, just because, it would be a little bit more visible than the standard kit would represent. And one of the things that sets the B-17s, especially the early B-17s, apart was the use of wood and plywood for the interior structure, like the floors and stuff. And so there was a lot of areas where I needed to either add like a raised surface to represent that wood, or modify what was there to represent the fact that they had this like plywood and laminate wood laid down. And so what I'm doing here is essentially creating this laminate wood surface that would go in the front of the nose, and I wanted it to be raised because there's kind of like where the actual bombardier seat would sit, where the seat would be is kind of a slightly recessed area, and so it was just, in my mind, it was a little bit easier to represent the wood as a raised portion and have the rest of the compartment be the natural metal, the normal interior structure. And so I'm using some various types and thicknesses of evergreen styrene. I apologize, I don't know offhand what exact thicknesses I used. I tried to keep things relatively on the thin side, just to maintain some semblance of scale thickness here. But like a lot of the scratch building that I do, there is going to be some level of, overscaled. But I think in the cramped confines of the nose compartment, it's going to just, in my opinion, the overscaled, look of things will lend to the detail and allow me to kind of push some contrast a little bit and make that detail pop a little bit more. So right here, I've just getting the quote unquote wood part glued down and contoured to that upslope of the nose floor. But I also had to make sure there was a cutout area for where the bombardier's, all of his instruments were, the salvo options and things like that. And then there's a little platform that the Norden bomb sight would sit on. So I'm using a combination of the kit part and some plastic there to represent that. So I had to make a little cutout there to get that to sit in there, but fortunately that sits in there pretty nicely. One of the other reasons why I wanted to make this modification is because the actual wood floor extends out into the plexiglass nose a little bit farther than the kit part was representing. So there was another modification there. On the rear wall of the nose compartment, there was a lot of areas that were covered in like a canvas cover or like a canvas material to, essentially cover up a lot of the backside of like the instrument panel, all the instruments and all the electrical stuff going in there. And so I'm using some really thin plastic here. It's almost, I would say this is like cardstock thickness of plastic. And the reason why I'm using that is because it allows me to maintain the rigidity of plastic and be able to glue the plastic to the kit parts quite easily. But at the same time, it allows me to create some easily to deform it and create some waves in it that might give it a somewhat like a heavy canvas material. And I was able to punch through from the opposite side to make it look like there was metal fasteners on there. And so I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. Next up, I'm going to do some modifications to the navigator's table. The kit has these parts on it that are meant to help it glue and register between the fuselage wall and the floor that just aren't present on the actual aircraft. So I removed those. Additionally, I'm removing some electrical components that are on the back wall here that didn't quite match up with my references. But because of the way that part is molded, it left a hole. So I have to kind of blank that over with some of that really thin plastic. But I have other parts that are going to be covering that, so it'll largely become hidden and you won't really notice. So here's just kind of like the simple dry fitting of these parts just to see how it's all going to fit together. And you can see just how tight and cramped this compartment was. I mean, there's two men in here. You have the navigator, the bombardier, plus there was 3 guns in here, then bomb sight, plus all the ammunition for the guns. Like, it was very tight in there. Another thing I wanted to do was add a little bit more detail to the bombardier's equipment here. The kit detail is pretty sparse and shallow. Just doesn't really look all that great and doesn't really match up with reference pictures. And so the bombardier's equipment here had multiple gauges and salvo options and switches and toggles, and so I wanted to represent that a little bit better. So I'm drilling out some of that really thin plastic, and that'll kind of help me create some instrument faces, and then I can add some bits of styrene on there to represent switches and whatnot, and just make it. Again, it's not 100% accurate, but I think the detail is a little bit more in line with what the reference pictures show, and just a little bit more added detail there, in my opinion. And again, when it comes to like adding the switch detail and stuff, it'll definitely be out of scale, and it'll look a little chunky, but once it's in there and it's all painted up and it's in this tiny dark little compartment, it allows it to stand out a little bit more and catch your eye without necessarily looking awful. One of the things that I was really keen on portraying here is if you've seen the movie The Memphis Belle from the early 90s, that was like a very informative movie for me as a child growing up, and I wore out my VHS copy of that movie. But there's a moment in there where they have to go around on their bomb run because the target is covered in clouds, and the navigator, in kind of like a moment of frustration, tries to toggle the bombs, and there's this moment where the bombardier and the navigator are kind of fighting over the switch, and there's you have this little cover that protects the switch that you have to push down, and then you can toggle the bombs, and they fight over this, and I really wanted to make sure that I added in that little detail to this bomb. I don't know that was necessarily an accurate because this equipment changed and evolved throughout the life of the B-17, so I don't know if this particular B-17 would have had that specific bomb salvo mechanism, but it was important to me that I represent that, just as kind of like a throwback to my childhood and that those informative years for me that really solidified why the B-17 is such an iconic aircraft to me, and it was just something that, so this is the actual toggle here, and I have the cover down, and the, in my mind, they've already been on the bomb run at this point. They're returning home. The cover is down and the switch has been thrown. And so there's a tiny little Easter egg for you. Well, for me, really, that was purely for me and for my enjoyment, was to represent that little mechanical piece. But I'm pretty happy with it. So as you can see, that's how the equipment fits within the fuselage there, and pretty nice. I wanted to add a little bit of detail to the navigator's table here. So the navigator's table would have been a plywood table, and it would have had kind of like an aluminum strip running around the outside edge of it. So that's what I'm doing here, is just getting this glued down. Once I get it glued on and it cures, then I'll trim it down, and it'll look nice. And again, it's one of those absurdly minute details that no one will probably ever pick up on the finished model, but I'm happy it's there. So on a lot of the B-17Fs that I was looking at that had the same nose configuration as Yield Pub, there was this little like rack of equipment right next to the navigator, and I assume it was like windage, equipment and obviously navigation equipment. And so I'm just using a little bit of extra spare brass here to represent that bracket, and then I pulled out some random boxes from my spare bits to put in there to represent that equipment that the navigator would have used to do his job. So this is all being glued on with CA glue, super glue, and because I'm doing different types of material there. So here I'm doing a little bit more dry fitting, trying to figure out how I want to do the ammo box. There was two different ways that the ammunition was stored for the navigator's gun. There was a version where, and what the kit represents is that the ammunition would sit directly above the navigator's station. So the ammunition would feed into the left side of that cheat gun. A lot of the other versions that I saw, the ammunition was off to the right above the bombardier's equipment, and it would feed into the gun on the right side. And that's ultimately what I chose to represent here. And I saw different versions, but what was neat was I saw this version of like a bracket with two ammo cans in there, and I kind of gravitated towards that. So that's just ultimately what I decided to represent. So I'm just using, so the ammo cans are from the kit, and then I just built a bracket around it out of some of that really thin plastic. I created this little retaining strap, and then that will sit just right there above that first window, and then will feed down into the gun on the right side. Now the kit provides you a couple of seats for the navigator and the bombardier. However, they are not quite correct. So we're going to remove that incorrect back portion, backrest here, and we're going to scratch build a more correct looking backrest for the seat. And so I'm just using a little bit of spare photo etch fret. It's really good idea to hang on to your spare photo etch. You never know when you might need just extra little pieces, but also at the same time just having the extra strips, because it's a good way to get uniform strips of brass in various lengths and widths. And so, for example, I can use this little piece here as the kind of the back bracket of the seat, and then do a new cushion here out of plastic, and then finally just using a little spare doohickey from from my spares bin as the little adjustment piece on the back. So that was pretty much all there was to do for the seat. The larger ammo cans are hollow on the backside, but because you'll be able to see the backside through some of the windows, I had to blank them off with some spare plastic. It's a pretty easy modification to make, and one that will prevent it from looking, just like an empty box there. Now we can start adding some damage to the nose here, and I'm using this grinding bit in my Dremel to thin out the plastic. And something you need to be careful about when you're doing this type of modification to a kit is you can very easily melt the plastic. And by the way, there's an example of how the ceramic blade snaps. Unfortunate. So you want to make sure when you're doing any kind of grinding on plastic, you're using a slow speed setting. You don't want this thing, cranking out at 10,000 RPMs, and you just want to slowly grind away the plastic until it's thin enough that you can easily cut through it. And the way that you can tell that it's thin enough is if you hold the plastic up to the light, you'll be able to see light shining through. And the thinner the plastic, the brighter the light will look. And that's kind of your indication. And once you get the plastic thin enough, it's really easy to cut and to trim and to make it look like damaged and twisted metal. But again, you have to be really careful that you're not over cranking your rotary tool and melting the plastic, because then you just end up having melted plastic. And I've seen other people attempt to do damage with varying degrees of success, but the ones that I think look the least good are the ones that just look like melted plastic, like they took a soldering iron to the plastic and just melted a hole into it. That's just not how thin aluminum reacts to bullet damage, cannon damage, or flak damage. So it's a somewhat time-consuming process, especially when you have an entire B-17 that you have to add damage to. But I promise you that if you take it slow, take it one little piece of damage at a time, and don't melt the plastic, it'll pay off in the long run, hands down. Now, if you look at different artist rendition of Ye Olde Pub and how the nose was damaged, there's lots of different versions of how it was done. Some of them have like a lot of the canopy blown away. Some of them have the side of it, the bottom of it. I ultimately chose to do the top portion as damaged and exposed. And additionally, you'll see a lot of artwork depicting the nose, like the nose gun configuration with the two offset guns, similar to how Memphis Belle was. And from what I can tell, and based on all the reference picture from contemporaries from the bomb group, they all had the centerline mounted gun, usually just a single gun. So I saw some that had the twin 50 in the nose, but most of them were a single 50 centerline nose, as opposed to the two kind of off-center 50 caliber mounts. So ultimately, that's the one that I went with, because I felt like it was the more likely option that the pub had. And that's not to downplay the amazing artwork that's out there of Ye Olde Pub. Just to me, this is what felt to be slightly more accurate. Cutting up a clear part is really difficult because clear plastic tends to be way more brittle than your standard plastic. So you have to really be careful. So I scored the plastic first before going through and trimming it. And that worked out pretty good. I have some 3D printed details here from a friend of mine. He goes by the handle Warhawk in Scale on Instagram. I'll put a link down to his cults page here. But he's done up a set of detail parts for the B-17, and he offers them for free. So I'm gonna link it down below. Check him out. Go support him on Cults. He does some great work here for a lot of like the smaller details, like the rheostats for the heated suits, the oxygen regulators, the little walk-around oxygen bottles, things like that. And he has additional details that I'm going to add into the cockpit here as well. The cockpit is not terribly detailed. I mean, out of the box, it looks pretty good, and especially considering the fact that you really can't see well into the cockpit once it's all, everything is all closed up. But I did want to replace some of the molded in detail with slightly more accurate detail, as I mentioned, from Warhawk and Scale. So he provides the center console, instrument panel, new oxygen bottles for the cockpit, and that requires you have to figure out what you want to do with these sidewalls. Now, again, the sidewalls don't totally accurately represent what the B-17 cockpit area looks like. It should be a little bit more concave and less straight up and down on the back portion of it. So I ended up cutting out and just straight up removing the back portion of the sidewalls. but keeping the actual cockpit portion because those are fairly accurate. And in just a moment, I'm going to turn things over to my father, and he's going to give you a little bit of history on the pilot, Charlie Brown.
When we tell the story of Charlie Brown, we usually jump to that incredible day in 1943 when his shattered B-17 was spared by a German fighter ace in one of the most extraordinary acts of mercy in modern warfare. But to truly understand Charlie Brown, the man in the cockpit, we need to look at the years before that moment. Who was he before the war, before that mission, before the name became part of one of the greatest stories in the honor of the skies? Charlie Lester Brown was born in 1922 in West Virginia. He grew up in the rolling hills of the Appalachians, the son of a coal miner. Like many boys of that generation, he grew up during the Great Depression. Times were hard, money was tight, but families held together with grit and faith. Charlie was bright, hardworking, and full of curiosity. He had a strong sense of duty instilled into him early. His family, though not wealthy, raised him with the values of honesty, perseverance, and responsibility. He wasn't born into privilege. Everything he achieved, he had to earn. And from a young age, he dreamed of flying. When the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, Charlie Brown was just 19 years old. Like thousands of young men of his generation, he volunteered. He joined the U.S. Army Air Force, determined to serve his country from the sky. Candidates needed not only courage, but also intelligence, mechanical skill, and almost instinctive feel for the aircraft. Charlie worked his way through the demanding program: ground school, flight training, navigation, gunnery. In 1943, he had earned his wings and his commission as a second lieutenant. He was assigned to fly the B-17 Flying Fortress, one of the iconic heavy bombers of the war. The B-17 was called the Flying Fortress for a good reason. With 4 engines, 13 machine guns, and a reputation for toughness, it was designed to withstand brutal punishment and still bring its crew home. But it was also a dangerous assignment. Flying at high altitude, often in daylight raids deep into enemy territory, B-17 crews faced furious opposition from the German fighters and deadly flak batteries. Casualty rates were high, sometimes approaching 50%. Each B-17 carried a crew of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and gunners manning every corner of the aircraft. These were not just names on a roster. They became a family. They ate together, trained together, faced danger together. As a pilot, Charlie Brown was their captain, responsible for their lives. That responsibility weighed heavily on him. He was young, just 21, but in the skies over Europe, youth didn't matter. Leadership did. Late in 1943, Brown and his crew were sent to England. They were assigned to the 527th Bomb Squadron, 379th Bomb Group, based in Kimbleton, east of London. From there, they would fly missions deep into Nazi-occupied Europe, France, the Low Countries, and Germany itself. For Charlie and his men, it was a new world: the damp English airfields, the constant roar of engines, the daily tension of the briefing rooms where targets were announced and crews steeled themselves for another mission. They knew the odds. Every time they climbed into their fortress, they faced the possibility they may not return. Charlie Brown was a fresh pilot, eager to prove himself. In December of 1943, he and his crew prepared for the very first combat mission. The target, Bremen, Germany. Bremen was a critical industrial center, filled with factories, shipyards, and military production. It was heavily defended. For a rookie crew, it was baptism by fire. Before that day, Charlie's only experience of combat was what he had been told in training. Stay in formation, trust your gunners, rely on the strength of the fortress. But he had not yet faced the black puffs of flak bursting all around, or the swarms of German fighters diving straight into the formation. That December mission to Bremen was meant to be just another run in the relentless Allied campaign to cripple Germany's war machine. For Charlie Brown, it would be the first time he led his crew into the heart of enemy territory. It's worth pausing to consider what that meant. Charlie was 21 years of age. At that age, today, many young people are just beginning college, starting their first jobs. Charlie Brown was leading 9 other men into mortal danger, commanding a machine loaded with bombs, flying into skies where death was all around. The pressure on the bomber pilots was immense. Every decision, whether to adjust altitude, whether to push through flak, whether to hold formation, could mean life or death to the entire crew. And Charlie felt that weight, but he was determined to bring his men home. On the morning of December 20th, 1943, Charlie Brown and his crew climbed into their B-17, which they had nicknamed Ye Old Pub. It was to be their first mission. Bremen, the target, the defenses, and the danger were all real. What they did not know was that the mission would test them more severely than they could have ever imagined. By the time the formation crossed into Germany, flak was exploding around them, fighters were swarming. The old pub would be hit again and again. Engines would fail, crewmen would be wounded. The bomber itself would be ripped apart. In the middle of all that chaos, with his plane nearly destroyed, Charlie Brown would face a German fighter ace named Franz Stigler, an encounter that would change both of their lives forever. Before that moment, Charlie Brown was simply a young man from West Virginia, the son of a coal miner, a newly trained pilot leading his crew into their first mission. He was untested, but he was ready. It's important to remember that behind every act of heroism or mercy in war are ordinary people. Young men like Charlie Brown, shaped by their families, their training, and the values they carry with them. That is who Charlie Brown was before the encounter, a 21-year-old American pilot carrying the weight of command, stepping into the unknown skies of Europe for the very first time.
Next up, we have the radio compartment. Now, this is an area that I knew was going to have a lot of it exposed, and so there were certain details that I wanted to make sure that I added. Additionally, the damage here I wanted to represent was an area where, in the book, it's described as a few 20mm cannon shells had entered the compartment and exploded and essentially blew out a portion of the fuselage. And so this was an area where I wanted to make sure I could represent this idea that the fuselage had been blown out and ripped apart and was just kind of, hanging onto the outside of the airframe. And so in order to achieve this, I had to remove a section of the fuselage. And so just as I described before with the Dremel, you drill it out slowly, thinning the plastic out, and then you can go ahead and cut it. And there was a few areas where the plastic was still a little on the thick side, so I wanted to make sure that I thinned that out. And because there is the top portion of the fuselage, I had to make sure that I had some corresponding damage there as well. And one of the things that I wanted to do here to represent that ripped out fuselage was using some of the black magic metal. that I portrayed a little bit in the previous episode, and I really wanted to try and present this idea that, not only was the panel blown out, but, there was a lot of like shrapnel and shredded material there. And so in addition to the blown out panel, I'm trying to represent a lot of, torn up and chewed up metal. And something that I didn't mention in the first portion of this segment is when you're doing the damage, the direction that you use the knife from, whether it's from the inside of the fuselage or the outside of the fuselage, will dictate what type of damage is happening. So, for example, if I'm trying to represent a bullet impact, or like the cannon impact here on this side, I'm going to use my knife from the outside and push it in. If I'm wanting to represent, an explosive action from the inside pushing out, I will use the knife to cut from the inside out. And that will, inform the direction that the damage is happening. And so as I was going throughout adding damage to the aircraft, I was trying to pay attention to direction, especially on things like the tail or the wings, where you have a thin section of structure and a hole on one side and a hole on the other side, where one was an entry wound essentially, and one was an exit wound. And so it was important to keep track of that and to make sure that I was trying to portray it as accurately as possible. So here I'm using some of that black magic metal to represent the skin that's been peeled back, and trying to just kind of roughly cut it to shape, get it in approximately the right area. And then right now I'm going to mark out where the panel lines are. One of the nice things about this black magic metal is because of its durability, I'm actually just using the backside of a knife blade there. You can score and essentially create panel lines. Additionally, you can add rivet detail to it as well, just much as you would to plastic, without it actually like punching through. I mean, I guess if you pushed hard enough, yes, you could probably get it to punch through, but it's pretty durable stuff, and it allows you to add these kinds of details so that it can, roughly match up with the plastic surface. And then what I was going to do is start, adding more jagged edges, damage, using these tweezers to really like bend and dent and manipulate the edges to make it look like this has been torn, and there's violence here, adding some additional holes in there as well. And then finally adding a little bit of that internal structure, the ribs and the stringers and things like that, just to help kind of sell the look on it. Now, what you're seeing here actually doesn't end up being the final product. I end up about halfway through, I realized I wasn't quite happy with how it was looking, and I ended up redoing that whole section, but essentially using the same process. Now, another very, very specific point of damage here is the right waist section. And in the book, it's described that some 20 millimeter cannon shells exploded in the right waist section, essentially deleting the right waist area. It says the gun was completely ripped from its mount, and massive hole there. And so this is going to be kind of one of the major focal points of the model here, because not only is it going to be damaged and you're going to be able to see inside the fuselage here, but you're going to be able to see a lot of what's happening inside the fuselage, and there's a lot of activity going on in this section of the aircraft. And so I'm going through doing my normal Dremel thing, and now I'm going to take my knife and start cutting away to represent that damage. And what was important for me here is to really kind of convey this idea that the skin of this aircraft had just been obliterated essentially, and the right waist gunner himself was actually critically injured as a result of this, and I'll describe that a little bit later on. And just to kind of point to the violence here. But what I was mentioning before about when you're adding damage to an aircraft, it's important to understand what's behind the damage that you're adding. And so one of the things here that I realized as I was going through this is by opening up this area here, there's actual windows that fit into those waist gun positions, and it varied depending on the B-17 model. Some of them were fixed in place. Some of them were just you'd like pull this plexiglass panel out and set it aside. From what I can tell, this version of the B-17 had a variant of the window that would actually slide. It would slide forward, and so I had to make sure that I was representing that actual window and its mechanism for sliding inside the fuselage in its kind of in its stowed configuration, and I had to be aware that was going to be behind that damaged area. So right now I'm fitting in some of the internal structure here for the waist section, the little areas that the waist gunners would stand on. They had these wooden planks that they would stand on. There's the ammunition holders, and there's tons of different configurations of how the guns would be mounted, how the ammo would be stored. Sometimes it was attached to the wall, sometimes it was attached to the floor. There's a lot of different variants here, so you'll have to do research if you're doing something similar on what your particular subject had. From the best of my knowledge, this would be similar to what the pub would have had, the configuration that I end up with. This is that structure that I was telling you about, the mechanism that would allow these windows to slide into place and then slide open, and they could swivel the gun and point it out the window. As it wasn't always, the guns weren't always, or the gunner's position wasn't always open while the aircraft was flying, typically only when they were in the combat area. And so they had these like tracks that the window would slide on. So that's what I'm trying to represent here. And I had to do this for both sides as well. And then there's some additional armor that I'm adding here that I noticed in various reference pictures for the gunners, and get that installed in there. And here's where, as from what I can see, the ammunition would have been stored in this configuration and would have fed to the gun on the left side for the left waist, and then on the right side for the right waist. Additionally, there was some more armor plating that would have gone just below the window, and so I've got to make sure I get that represented here, so that the gunners needed a little bit of protection. It wouldn't have been much, but something's better than nothing. And get this the structure here for where the gun would attach to the actual window mount itself. So it's basically like a window sill, in essence, going on here, and that eventually connects up to the gun mount itself, which you'll see it a little bit later on. So I'm removing the mount from the kit part, and I put this little bracket on, and then you can see the hole there in that little semicircular piece. So the gun mount will drop into that hole, and then will attach up to that bracket. Now again, there's many different configurations, so this isn't necessarily going to be the correct configuration for all B-17Fs, but it's what I gravitated towards and what looked good to me. So, as I mentioned, they had these sliding windows, and when I was doing the damage, I initially didn't realize that I had a bullet hole that would be right where the window would be stowed. So I had to add some damage to the window to line up with that that damage on the outside. And this is one of those details that is not visible on the finished model, but I know it's there. Now you know it's there, and it's something that I like. We're going to be moving into a section here that's kind of an interesting section for me to talk about, and that's the crew. So, as I was contemplating doing this project, one of the things that I wrestled with internally was how best to represent the crew. Now, I often add figures to my model kits. I like adding figures to my model kit. It adds a sense of scale. It adds a sense of life to a model. But this was really one of the first times that I was representing actual people that have names. And in addition to that, I had to figure out how I wanted to represent death and injury to these people. As I mentioned before, the right waist gunner was severely injured. In fact, his left leg was pretty much severed below the knee, and he ends up surviving, but it's very critical. The tail gunner, he was killed rather quickly by some 20 millimeter cannon fire, and and it was very violent, and I really struggled with how I was going to depict that. And I kind of had two schools of thoughts here. One was, I wanted to be accurate and represent everything as accurate as I could to the event, but also understanding that would require depicting some rather violent death on my model, and knowing that I would be putting this out on YouTube, that I have young viewers who watch my channel, and I try to maintain a rather family-friendly channel, in spite of the overall military-themed subject matter that I do, and also that it was my intention to bring this to shows and whatnot, and how to find that balance between not making it overly gratuitous, but at the same time realizing that these were real people. They really died. They were really injured, and that their story, deserved to be told. And I think it deserved to be told accurate. And in fact, I wrestled with this so much that I ended up calling my brother, who's an Air Force veteran. I talked to my nephew, who's a Navy veteran, and talked to a few other people to get their opinions on how best to do this. And ultimately, I decided that it was going to be, in my opinion, the best way to honor these men was to do it as accurately as possible. And that meant it's going to have a level of violence to it. Now, you're not going to see that in this episode. A lot of that's going to be covered in the next episode, but it was important to me to make sure that I was getting this done correctly and accurately, and trying to really, capture this moment in time of this terrified crew. And in the end, I'm quite pleased with the work that I did on the crew. They're not perfect. They're not going to be super accurate. They're not going to have all the right equipment and uniforms and everything, but I think that the story that they convey will be accurate. So moving on now to the wings of the aircraft, there was a lot of significant damage that I needed to portray, and what's interesting is there's a very specific portion of damage that's called out in the book, where the crew and eventually the ground crew on the ground understand that there's a hole in the wing that was the perfect size for an 88 millimeter flak shell, or flak round, and what they believe is the flak round essentially it was a direct hit. It hit the aircraft, passed straight through the wing, but didn't detonate. And so that, things like that is like, okay, I want to make sure that I want to call that out. The engines were heavily damaged. The number 2 engine, at the time that I'm portraying the aircraft, was shut down, and it was damaged by flak pretty early in the mission, early in the bomb raid. The number 3 and 4 engines were damaged and were not running at full power. And so they estimate that the aircraft was probably only flying on about 60% power by the time that Franz Stigler came up to them. The number 1 engine was pretty much the only engine that was relatively undamaged. And another thing about the wings of the aircraft is there's a lot of internal structure that you have to be aware of when you're doing damage, and just note that you'll want to represent things. So here's my interpretation of what the number 2 damage looks like. This engine, like I said, was shut down and it was not running, and so I wanted to make sure there was a fair amount of damage there. One thing about the HK kit here is that it represents the cowl flaps in an open position, and in flight, at altitude, cruising, or even with a shutdown engine, the cowl flaps would have been closed in order to maintain aerodynamic airflow over the engine itself. And so I had to go through and modify all of the cowl flaps, and it essentially just boils down to me just bending each cowl flap so that it's closer conformed to the body, or to the nacelle, so that it's a little bit more accurate there. I looked online to see if there was any kind of replacement part for it, and I contemplated just like cutting all the cowl flaps off and then replacing them with plastic, but in the end, bending them, I think it gave me the result that I was looking for. And and so I'm probably adding more damage to this engine nacelle than was than would have actually happened, but in order to convey the story that I was trying to tell, I really wanted to make sure that it was understood that this engine was knocked out and out of commission. But also I wanted to open up some of that engine cowling to expose the phenomenally 3D printed engines that I got from Matters of Scale. I'm going to put a link down to their website down below, but the 3D printed engines they have are essentially a drop-in replacement to the kit parts and just a massive improvement over what the kit offers. And so another thing that's very distinctly pointed out in terms of damage to the aircraft is the fact that the left horizontal stabilizer was pretty much gone. The way that it's described in the book is there was only about 4 feet of stabilizer left attached to the aircraft. The rest of it was just gone. It was just a nice clean shear break. And so this was a pretty easy modification to make, just in terms of I just have to cut off most of the horizontal stabilizer. I also decided to completely remove the rest of the elevator as well. But now this leaves me with a rather large opening that would have internal structure. So I whipped up some parts on my computer and 3D printed some structure here that I could, essentially mix and match to build out some structure here. I did have to do a significant amount of thinning of the plastic to better represent the thin nature of the actual aircraft, and to get the 3D parts to fit in there. But I was eventually able to get there and start able to add in some of the structure, the spar, things like that, and create some cool look to the inside of this. Now, what you'll end up seeing here differs slightly from the final result. Much like the panel in the radio room, I end up making some changes later on in the build. But again, it gives you an idea of what I'm going for. And we're going to be using the black magic metal here again to represent kind of the torn edges of the metal here. And again, this is just such a great versatile material. I'll leave a link down to this below as well, where you can find it and support Gets Mini for this phenomenal product. But yeah, we're just going to go ahead and glue this on. And just like on the radio operator area, I was able to kind of do some scoring to represent the panel lines and riveting, just to kind of help it match up. Now, it's not going to be a complete one-to-one match, but it's close enough for me. And again, we're going to go ahead and kind of damage up the very edge here, add some torn edges, jagged edges, and really give this the impression that the metal's been ripped away and torn away. It's not necessarily explained what damages the tail, or not the tail, sorry, the horizontal stabilizer. It's unclear if it's flak, if it's cannon fire from fighters. It's just described that it's there one moment and gone the next. And adding a little bit of some puncture marks here, and then finally doing some little bit of internal structure that'll kind of help sell the idea that that there was internal structure here to this portion. The final bit here that I was trying to figure out how I wanted to represent was the rubber de-icing boot that would be on the leading edge there, and I ended up just using some thin plastic to represent that. It also helped me eliminate having to sand and fill in that seam. Now, returning to the rudder that we previously looked at, I ended up deciding that I wanted to do way more damage than I'd originally planned. And in order to do that, in order to represent the fabric covered structure here, I ended up designing and 3D printing the internal structure for the rudder. And this took some trial and error, and I'm not the greatest at modeling 3D, so it's It's really pretty basic, and if you look close enough, you can kind of see where I had to, fudge some details. But what I'm going to end up doing is covering it in the black magic metal and then tearing it and shredding it to really give the appearance that like the rudder had been legitimately shredded. Now, either by cannon fire, machine gun fire, or flak, we'll leave that up to the imagination of the viewer. But I really wanted, and another thing that was kind of impressed in my mind that I wanted to represent was the idea that this fabric was like ripped and torn and blowing in the airflow of the aircraft, and that was kind of important for me to represent here. So starting off, and you'll see that I actually attached the 3D printed part to the front portion of the rudder, which would have been metal from the kit part, and it was just the back half of the rudder was actually fabric covered. So now we're going to go ahead and add the black magic metal on, and essentially what I'm just going to do is cover both sides of it, trim it down to size, and then I'll go through and start the shredding process, which was quite fun and kind of cathartic to do. Another thing, you'll notice kind of that notch cut out at the back of the rudder. That's where the trim tab would be. I decided that I was just going to have the trim tab just was completely removed and damaged enough that it's gone. So at this point, this is going to start wrapping up this portion of the model. Part 3 will be coming out next week, and that'll be the painting process and the weathering and kind of the final stages of this build. So if you've made it this far throughout the video, I know this is a long video, but I appreciate it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting this channel. I would like to give a big shout out to my patrons for helping to support the channel and allowing me to bring this kind of content to you. If you're liking the video series, go ahead and hit subscribe and like the video. Tell me what you think down below. Tell me your thoughts. I'd love to hear back from you guys. And we're going to finish off this video with some final pictures of all the work that we've done up to this point. So thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next episode. Greetings everyone, Barrett here with Hammerhead Model Making. We are back with the third and final episode in the Higher Call series. In this video, we're going to be finishing up Charlie Brown's The Old Pub, going through the whole paint process, weathering process, pretty much start to end here. And so I'm just kind of showing some pictures as a recap from the last episode. We were doing all the construction, scratch building, detailing of the interior of the pub. And now we're going to move on to the painting portion. Now, this video is going to be a little bit longer than the other two videos in the series. And there's a neat little bonus at the very end of the video, so I hope you'll stay through till the very end. But let's go ahead and jump into this. So we're starting off priming everything black. Not a big surprise here. And I'm going to be using some AK Extreme Metal paint here. This is duraluminum. And I've really taken a liking to this paint. And I've been recommended this. Normally I use like Alclad paints for doing heavy metal work. But they just tend to be not very durable. And so a lot of people have recommended, hey, you should use the AK Extreme Metals. They pretty much work the same way as Alclad. They just tend to be a little bit more durable, and I'm definitely finding that here. So this is a good project to kind of really push how much I like, or just my experience with it. Now, when it comes to painting Ye Olde Pub, and when it comes to painting B-17s in general, you will find there are a lot of different ways that it was done. I tried to do as good of research as I possibly could into how a B-17F would have been painted, and I came across a website called I think it was the One Soldier, or something like that, and it was essentially a very in-depth look at interior colors for B-17Fs with a lot of photographic evidence, a lot of original manuscripts from Boeing, things like that. And so essentially what I gathered, that for the most part, the interior of the B-17 would have been left natural aluminum. All of the bulkheads would have been bronze green, and a lot of the stuff in the cockpit would have been bronze green. Now, there's some debate that depending on the compartment, it may have had some soundproofing, and that would have also been kind of a shade of bronze green / interior green. I'm not doing any of the soundproofing in this particular build, so that's really not an issue. But so this is definitely not going to be like a definitive, the most accurate interior painting of a B-17 ever. But from what I gathered, this should be relatively close. So your mileage may vary. I'll give the standard answer here is check your references. And I'm pretty happy with the way it looked. And another big thing that you'll see with a lot of B-17 models, and I'm gonna, in this video, I'm gonna talk about painting B-17s in general. There's a couple of things that I'm gonna get to when we get to like the weathering stage, for example, that I think is important to point out when it comes to B-17s. But another thing that's kind of critical here is the use of wood inside the B-17. There was a lot of wood in here that was used for various different applications, but mainly it was for like flooring, tables, things like that, and sometimes doors. And so there's going to be a lot of different variations on how it's arranged within the aircraft. The way that I'm doing it, just kind of what looks good to me. And I'm not going to say it's any like more right or more wrong than any other version. So again, check your references. Your mileage may vary. Now, to do the actual wood effect here, I'm trying something that I saw in an old issue of Fine Scale Modeler many, many years ago. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm spraying the parts that I want wood in Tamiya Buff, and then I'm applying oil paint directly to the Tamiya paint. There's no clear coat in between, no varnish, no nothing. And as you can see here, I'm applying it fairly heavily. This isn't like a wash. The paint's not thinned down or anything like that. I'm applying it pretty heavily onto the wood parts, but there is still enough translucency left that you can kind of see some of that buff showing through. Now I'm taking this fan brush, soaking it in thinner, and I'm kind of dragging it across the surface. And what this is going to hopefully do is give me that effect of like wood grain and some texture in there. And I'll be honest, I was actually quite pleased with the overall effect. You will notice that I have a darker brown on my little cardboard palette there. I do eventually mix in some of the darker tones later on, but unfortunately I did not film that. But just note that essentially it's the same process repeated over on top of like the ochre color. But in the end, this got me the effect that I was looking for, and I was quite pleased with it. So now, one of the things that I need to do is do some masking on some turrets. And the reason I need to do that is because the bottom turret, for example, part of it is clear and part of it is just gray plastic. Now, I'm applying the Edward T-face masks come with masks for both the inside and the exterior of the turret. And what this will allow me to do is paint the full interior of the turret to just so that it's not just kind of like clear plastic on the inside. Now, in hindsight, because I'm recording this, a significant amount of time after I've actually done this work, you're not going to see the inside of that turret at all. It is nearly impossible to see the inside of that turret. But at the time, I felt like it was like, oh, I'm doing something really cool here, painting the inside of the turret. It's going to look all nice and accurate. And I did the same thing with the top turret as well. But, I mean, it's still a good exercise, and it's a good practice to have. So at this point, I can do some pre-shading on a lot of these internal parts here. So that's just what I'm doing, is just a little bit of white pre-shading. And then we're going to go ahead and hit it with our bronze green color. Now, Boeing used bronze green on the interior of this as opposed to like the more traditional, quote unquote interior green. And essentially this is just a darker, like a darkened version that has like a little bit of a like metallic pigment to it, and kind of unique, kind of interesting. I like it. It's different, and I'm not as used to using this color, so I wasn't as familiar with shading it and highlighting it and things like that. But in the end, I still like it. It's neat, and it's just different and a variation on what I'm used to doing. So now we can get the oxygen bottles painted up. This is just Tamiya yellow going down over the black primer and white model. So now we're going to go ahead and give everything a nice good solid coat of gloss here. This is going to protect all of our paintwork, but it's also going to give us a good base from which to do some weathering for the interior. And now one could argue that the interior wouldn't necessarily be super heavily weathered. This aircraft was relatively new and had not done a lot of combat missions prior to this point. But in the pursuit of visual storytelling, I felt like I needed to add some contrast, some depth to the interior paintwork here. So I will be doing a little bit of weathering, not a ton, mainly just consisting of a wash, things like that. But just note that this may not necessarily be prototypical for mid-war aircraft that had seen very little combat at that point. But for our wash, we're going to be using our dark brown wash for green vehicles. And this is my standard, one of my favorite products to use. And if you're asking yourself, no, I'm not endorsed by AmboMig, but if they're listening, I wouldn't mind an email. But in all seriousness, like I've been using this product now for a number of years, and I like its versatility and its ease of use, and it works for me. So that's why I like it. But we're going to go ahead and give everything a nice good coat once it dries, which usually takes about 30-40 minutes, depending on how heavy you apply it. The excess can just be wiped away with a cotton bud. Now, this only works if you're applying it over a nice good solid gloss coat. If you don't want to apply it over just bare paint, it will eat into the paint a little bit, or stain the paint, and it's very difficult to remove. So make sure you're doing it over a nice good solid gloss coat. But you can see here, I'm just trying to remove all the excess in between all of the structural components of the aircraft. So this just helps add some definition to a lot of the stringers and ribs of the aircraft, and really just kind of makes them pop a little bit. And especially where the ability to see into the aircraft is going to be very limited. That contrast helps significantly. So with the wash done, I'm going to go ahead and give everything a matte coat. This is going to knock down that shine, seal in our wash, and kind of allow me to move on to the next steps of the process. And this is like a step that this final varnish step is largely just going to depend on what you want the overall look to be, like the final outcome to be. So that could be matte, that could be semi-gloss, it could be satin. You could even keep it as a gloss. You could do another gloss coat over, seal in all your work, and that could be done. So it's if you're following along or trying to do something similar, you don't have to follow the exact final varnish that I use, but just note that I'm using it because that's the effect that I want to achieve. So now we can go ahead and assemble the ball turret together. Now, this turret is quite nice in all fairness to HK models. It's a huge improvement over what the old monogram turrets used to be, and it looks pretty nice. But again, like, it's hard to see everything that's inside. So just be wary. Like, unless you want to scratch build the hatch open on the back for the gunner to get into, and you can actually see into it, that might be an option, but you would have to add more details to it if you chose to do that. So at this point, pretty much all the paint work is done, and we can start getting all of our components and sections and compartments put together. And what I really like about having the wood effect in there is just kind of how much it pops against that green color. So you kind of get like the yellowish brown of the wood popping against the green of the interior, and it helps provide a nice like splash of color and visual interest to the interior, as opposed to something that was just like all green or all gray or whatever. And again, because there are going to be portions of the aircraft that are going to be more open than normal, it helps to have all that additional detail in there. So yeah, there's a lot of components going in here. This is some of that 3D printed stuff that I originally had done up in the previous episode, and just how much nicer the detail is on these parts. And what's cool about the 3D printed instrument panel is the HK model's decal for the instrument panel fits perfectly on it. So nice little bonus there to be aware of. There are a lot of parts that go into the interior of this model. I mean, it's a very busy interior. It's a very busy model. And you'll want to make sure that as you're going through the process that you're like triple checking the instructions, because you don't want to get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm ready to close up the fuselage, and then realize you've forgotten something because it was on another page. So just be aware, be careful, and pay attention, because you don't want to miss anything in here and, miss out on a crucial detail or something like that, or even a structural thing. You will be noticing that I haven't actually done anything for the bomb bay, either in the last episode or in this one, and that's because I chose to use the bomb bay as the location to support the model in its in-flight pose. And it just made sense. Like, the aircraft had already completed its mission. It's already dropped its bombs. It would have no reason to have its bomb bay doors open to see the detail in there. And so it just made sense that would be where I would mount the pole that's going to hold up the aircraft. And so that's why you don't see anything in there. But just note that the kit does have a very well detailed bomb bay, and it's pretty nice. As I mentioned before, lots of detail going into this, lots of little parts. There's a lot of parts that I chose to paint separately just to make it a little bit easier overall. And I say easier just because it's easier to paint the individual parts, but it's not necessarily easier because you have a lot of loose parts that you have to keep track of. But I just find it a little bit easier to manage for me personally. I know other people that will glue all the parts all down in and hand paint them all at in situ, and that works for them. And that's awesome. Congratulations. I'm happy for them. Just, it doesn't work for me. I'm not very good at doing that. So next up, with the actual interior mostly done, we can start working on the crew. And I mentioned this in the last video. These are not going to be like perfect facsimiles of a bomber crew in 1943. They're going to be close, and in my defense, kind of in my mind, the way that it worked out is, they've dropped altitude, they're flying really low, they're all injured, they're dying, they're panicking, they're frightened. They've been moving around the aircraft trying to help different people. Like, they're not all wearing all their normal gear. That was just kind of like the way that it worked out in my mind, and made sense to me. So I think it'll be good enough, because I hope in the end that people will be able to focus on the story that's trying to be told, rather than like the super hyper details, accuracy details, things like that. And it was more important to me that that these figures have emotion and convey a sense of what's happening. And I think I'm now a few weeks, at the time that I'm recording this, I'm a few weeks away from having completed the kit, or completed the project, and each time I look at it and really stare at it and just kind of take it all in, like I'm definitely able to get the story beats out of these figures. I wish that I was a more proficient figure painter, and I wish that I had the skills to really push the detail on these figures. And I at some point, that's something that's a skill that I want to hone and sharpen. But for now, this will suffice, and it'll get me to where I want to go. Another thing that I mentioned in the previous video about the figures was my dilemma with trying to depict death and violence in here. And so in just a little bit, I'm going to have a little bit of a warning on the screen, because I'm going to be portraying blood and violence here. And I try to maintain a somewhat family-friendly image here on the channel. And so just be warned if you have young, sensitive viewers. I mean, it's not like crazy realistic graphic, but nonetheless, it can be violent. So just as a warning here, be aware that there will be a few shots of blood here, mainly in this one section. There's another section a little bit later on where you'll see it, and then at the very end, you'll catch glimpses of it. But I just wanted people to be cognizant of what's going on. And again, I really struggled with how I should depict this and how I should treat this. And in the end, I decided just to be as authentic and accurate as possible, so as to not diminish the sacrifice and bravery of these men. And so for the effects that I'm going with, I'm just using Tamiya Clear Red. This would be probably a little bit brighter than normal blood, but again, because of the limited visibility into the aircraft interior, I kind of needed it to be a little bit more extreme, and I would say even maybe slightly cartoonish. But I think in the end, it gave the look that I was really after, and I think it helps to portray kind of the horrific nature of what happened to these men on this day. And so the figure there that was laying down, that is the right waist gunner, and he pretty much had his leg severed from 20mm cannon fire, destroyed his gun station, ripped his gun out the aircraft. The other torso there that you saw, that's the tail gunner. He was pretty much killed rather quickly through cannon fire from they believe an FW-190. And what I'm actually doing here is depicting, kind of the violence on the inside of the tail gunner's canopy. And it's really a morbid process of going through this and trying to be like, okay, I know what I'm depicting. I know what's happening, but it's strange. So anyways, we're going to go ahead and take a break from my commentary here. And we're going to have my father return. And he's going to give us a little bit of a perspective of Franz Stigler.
The Day I Met the B-17, told by Franz Stigler. Excerpts from A Higher Call by Adam Makos. It was December 20th, 1943, a cold, gray day over northern Germany. By then, I had flown more missions than I had cared to count. I had seen comrades shot down. I had been shot at more times than I could remember. That winter, my country was burning. The bombers came day after day, and we were ordered to stop them at all costs. That morning, I had already taken off once, fought, landed, refueled, and rearmed. And then, late in the day, I scrambled again. As I climbed into the sky in my Messerschmitt 109, I spotted something unusual. Off in the distance, lumbering slowly, was a B-17 Flying Fortress. It was not in formation. It was alone. That was strange. American bombers always flew together in great defensive boxes. To be separated usually meant only one thing. It was badly damaged. I pushed the throttle forward and closed in. As I came closer, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The bomber was shot to pieces. Its nose was smashed open, and its tail was shredded. One engine was dead, another was sputtering. The skin of the fuselage was torn open, and I could clearly see through the plane in places. And yet it was still flying. I moved behind it, preparing for an easy kill. A crippled bomber, that was exactly the kind of target we were expected to finish off. In fact, that kill would have completed my tally to earn the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. One burst from my machine guns, and it would be all over. But I looked more closely. Through the holes in the fuselage, I could see men inside. They were not fighting me. They were not manning their guns. They were wounded, tending to one another. I saw blood on the floor, bandages hastily wrapped, faces pale and exhausted. One gunner was slumped over, dead at his station. Another was barely conscious. And in that moment, my hand froze on the trigger. I thought of my training, I thought of my orders, and then I thought of something else. I remembered my time in North Africa, flying under Hans Joachim Marcel. He had told me once, "You fly by the rules of honor. Do not shoot a man in his parachute. You do not kill unnecessarily." Marcel had taught me that even in war, there are limits. Looking at the bomber, I realized these men were no longer combatants. They were helpless. To shoot them down would not have been a victory. It would have been murder. I eased my finger off the trigger and made my decision. I pulled up alongside the bomber, close enough to see the pilot in his seat. He was just a young man, maybe in his early 20s. His face was pale, his eyes locked straight forward, focused on survival. Later I learned his name, Charlie Brown from West Virginia. I flew wingtip to wingtip with him. At first he must have thought I was toying with him, about to finish the job, but instead I gestured. I tried to signal, "Turn east, land in Germany, you can surrender, and your men will live." But he did not understand, or maybe simply refused. He kept flying north, towards the North Sea, towards home. So I made another choice. If he was going to try to make it back to England, I would see him pass the coastal flak batteries. German anti-aircraft guns would fire on anything that came near, friend or foe. If they saw a lone B-17 limping by itself, they would surely destroy it. But if they saw a German fighter escorting it, maybe they would hold their fire. So I stayed by his side. We flew together, German and American, enemies who did not fire a shot at one another. I could see the disbelief on the faces of his crew as they peered out at me from their broken fortress. When we reached the coast, I gave him a final salute, an acknowledgement from one pilot to another. Then I broke away and turned back towards Germany. He continued on, alone across the sea. That was the end of the mission for me. I landed silent. I told no one. To spare an enemy's life was dangerous. If words had gotten back to my comrades, I could face a court-martial, even execution. So I kept it to myself. For decades, I never spoke of it. And yet, I never forgot it. You see, in war we are taught to hate, to dehumanize, to see only uniforms, not men. But that day, I did not see Nazis or Americans, victors or victims. I saw fellow airmen wounded and far from home, trying desperately to survive. I asked myself, what would I want if I were in that bomber? What would my family hope for if I were the one flying home with death all around me? And the answer was clear. I could not pull the trigger. Many years later, nearly 50 years, in fact, I finally met Charlie Brown. He had survived the flight. He made it back to England, and his crew had lived. When we met, he told me that for decades, he too wondered about the German pilot who had spared him. We embraced, not as enemies, but as brothers. Our friendship lasted the rest of our lives. When I think back to December 20th, 1943, I do not think of medals or victories. I think of a moment when mercy triumphed over hate. In that instant, I remembered that even in the darkest of wars, we still have the power to choose. I see the humanity in others, and to act not with cruelty, but with honor. That day, I chose not to kill. And it was one of the most important victories of my life.
I'll tell you what, my dad makes it hard to follow up his narration. Quite an interesting to get the perspective of Franz Stigler on the situation. And later on we'll hear back again from my father, kind of going over the full accounting of Charlie Brown, Yield Pub, and their mission to Bremen. Right now you can see on the build that I've been adding all of the final details to the interior, including a couple hundred 3D printed empty 50 caliber shells that have been littering around the bomber. I remember seeing pictures of the interior of the gunner's compartments after a mission, and there just being an ocean of spent brass in there. And that was one of the things that, from the very onset of this project, I knew that I wanted to try and capture that. And even though I didn't necessarily add as many 50 caliber shells as I probably could have, I think it conveys the point that they were on a mission and they had a job to do, and they tried to execute that job the best of their ability. And in so doing, the inside of these bombers get cluttered and cramped and full of debris and the detritus of war. You'll also notice I had a bunch of papers into some of the compartments. In the book, the author calls out the fact that in a couple of the compartments, like the nose compartment, the radio compartment that had been, had sections blown out and exposed to the airflow, there was papers everywhere. And so I tried to figure out, what kind of papers would those be? What kind of papers would they have on a bomber like this? And I came to the conclusion they were probably logs of some sort. I'm sure that the navigator had navigation logs. The bombardier had, target information, things like that. The radio operator would certainly have radio logs. And so that was kind of my thinking, is those types of logs that the crew would have kept on these missions would have been blown around, in these intense moments of carnage. And then you have all the spent brass everywhere. You have blood all over the interior. Everybody's bleeding and injured, and very, very chaotic. So at this point, I'm pretty much ready to close up the fuselage. And this was a moment in the build. So up to this point, this build had taken me about, I'd say almost 4.5 months. I wasn't working on it continuously. I was working on other projects at the same time. I had about usually between 2 and 3 different projects going on at any one time. So I'd work on this for a little bit, then switch over to the other projects. And there was a couple of periods of time where I didn't really have the drive and the fire to really like work on this full steam. And so there was just a lot of times where I just didn't work on it for a week at a time or 2 weeks at a time because I was I throughout this whole process I was apprehensive, like, am I going to get this right? Am I going to do it right? Is my vision, am I going to be able to realize my vision here? And this was one of those projects where I didn't want to screw up. Like, it was important enough to me that I didn't want it to get ruined and for it to turn out badly. And I knew that, as I was going through this whole process, adding all the details to the interior, that I caused a few self-inflicted fit issues, and I was kind of dreading having to take care of those. There was a really ugly seam around the nose that I was going to have to take care of. So the nose section is separate from the rest of the fuselage because they designed it that way so they could do the different, like the G variant with the chin turret and different window configurations for the nose. But HK Models decided to model that seam line not on a natural panel line. In fact, it's right between 2 panel lines. And so I knew that I was going to have to take care of that, and that was going to be tricky because I had to be careful with where I was doing it because it was next to a bunch of windows to the cockpit window. The turtle deck area of the aircraft, that was a separate part that had a little bit of fit, self-inflicted fit issues. And so there was just a lot of stuff that I was dreading getting to this point where the fuselage was finally ready to go together. And it was a long road. Fortunately, I had a lot of good support for this project. I communicated often with my patrons, bounced a lot of ideas off of them back and forth, and they were so extremely encouraging and gave me good insight and good tips and ideas on things that I could do. And so they gave me a lot of strength and determination to work, to keep working on this. And then a small group of my closest friends in the modeling community were also extremely supportive and helpful. So fortunately for me, I had those people to kind of help motivate me and push me and encourage me to really move on this project. Now, the kind of one of the funny parts here is I originally wanted to have this done for the Rocky Mountain Hobby Expo, which was way back in June. And I kept telling my patrons, yeah, I'm this is what I want to do. I'm going to hurry up and get this done. And they were all like, no, don't rush. You don't want to rush this. It's not going to end well if you rush it. And fortunately I listened to them and I took my time. And so the total time on the actual B-17 here was just a little under 7 months. And it's the longest I've ever worked on one single kit in my lifetime. And so it worked out how it was supposed to in the end. I mentioned earlier, I'm using the Bombay as the location to secure the post that's going to hold up the aircraft. And I needed to create a mounting system in there. And so I designed and 3D printed this plug that inserts into the Bombay and really kind of locks in there. I printed these little blocks here to create the spacers for it and really create this solid attachment point in there that is also easy to like. I can remove the aircraft from the stand so that I can transport it and store it and move it around as I need to, but it's easy to put it back on its post for the display, but it holds it and locks it into place. And so I had to go through many iterations to get the right shape and size for it to for me to be able to get it in there in the first place, and then but for it to like have the strength and rigidity it needed to support the weight of this kit, because there is not an insignificant amount of plastic in this kit, and a 1/48 scale B-17 is very large, so it needed to be strong enough to support the whole weight of the aircraft. And it's not at the center of balance on the aircraft. This actually holds it a little tail heavy, but in the end, I actually kind of like it that the actual aircraft has a slightly nose high attitude, but it makes sense to me because they were only running on about 60% of their available power at this point in the story. And so they probably would have had a slight nose up attitude anyways, just trying to maintain altitude. So in the end, I'm really happy with how it worked out, and it's a good system, and I'm quite pleased with it. So at this point now we can lock down the turtle deck. And like I said, there was a few slight issues here. I had to kind of force it down during the gluing process to make sure those gaps closed up. It still required a fair bit of sanding and filling. I'm not going to show the whole sanding and filling process on this. I've done that in countless other videos, and I already know the runtime for this video is going to be quite long, and just didn't make sense to add a lot of really repetitive nature. But just know that I spent probably a good solid week just filling and sanding seam lines all across the fuselage, not just the nose, but the bottom, everything. It took a while, but I got it done to a point that I was really happy with it. And now we can kind of start adding all the final clear parts and things like that to the exterior and prepare ourselves for the actual exterior painting. Overall, the clear parts fit pretty well. The larger windows in the nose here, I had slight issues getting them to fit, so I don't know if that was because the interior parts that they're supposed to interface with, I didn't get them properly aligned, which is the most likely culprit here, but nevertheless, gave me a little bit of a fit issue. Nothing terrible, though. The rest of it all fit really nicely and went in just fine. I was actually really pleased with how well the cockpit windows went in. I was a little afraid those weren't going to fit well, but they did, and get those all locked down. And then the next big challenge for this was actually like filling in all of the large cavities that I was going to have on the aircraft. And in the end, I decided on using cotton balls because I knew that they would be able to fill in the space, but not exert enough pressure to break details on the interior and knock stuff off, which would have been kind of a disaster if, like a critical figure or component on the interior got knocked loose after everything had been closed up and I wouldn't be able to reach in there and get the part fixed or reapplied. That would have been kind of devastating. So in the end, it was kind of a pain to deal with cotton balls because the fibrous nature of them, but I think it was worth it in the end to be able to fill in a lot of these voids with very little effort, and I think it worked out pretty good. So now we can kind of move on to the main event. Here is the painting, and like I've done before, everything gets primed black. I'm using the Rust-Oleum 2X black primer, and we're going to go ahead and start giving everything a coat of aluminum here. One of the very nice things about the HK kit that I didn't know going into this was it actually gives you separate parts for raised and lowered landing gear. So you don't have to make any modifications to the landing gear parts to have them in the raised position. That's actually pretty cool. That's very uncommon in model manufacturers. So there's a lot of parts getting painted aluminum just because they're aluminum, but I also needed to add a lot of aluminum to the actual airframe. And that's because in the process of being damaged, bullets, shells, flak damage, things like that, it'll hit the metal surface of the aircraft, and it can cause the paint to flake away from around those points of damage. And it was important to me to really try and portray that well and accurately. So what you're seeing me do here is kind of pre-paint this aluminum around all of the areas that could potentially have damage. And, areas where maybe not even necessarily like penetrating damage, but small bits of flak could still hit the surface of the skin, not penetrate and make a hole, but still be strong enough to flake paint. And so it was important that I try and get as I suppose I could have just completely painted the whole thing and that would have been fine. I chose not to, just purely just a conscious choice. And that probably would have given me a little bit more freedom to be a little bit more extreme with the distressing. But in the end, I'm still quite pleased. So the first step for this is going to be applying liquid mask. And I'm using just kind of a sharpened wooden dowel here. And I'm applying it around the very edges of the damage impact points. And this is going to be like representing that immediate paint flaking from around that point of impact. Chipping would have been fairly... I don't know if I have the right words to describe what it would look like, but it's a pretty solid, like the paint flakes off in large solid chips for the most part. And so that's what this is going to represent. This is a bit of a tedious process, and you have to really kind of go slow, take your time, and make sure you're getting all of the damaged areas. And on some of them, I'm adding more of the liquid masks. On others, I'm doing less, just to represent, different amounts of paint being chipped away. And but just trying to maintain those solid, essentially blocks of exposed aluminum around the aircraft. And this was another one of those details, just like the bullets, the 50 caliber casings on the floor, that from the onset of this project, I knew that I wanted to replicate, and it was going to be an important part of getting this right. So once those had dried, now I'm going in the same liquid mask and a sponge, and this is going to create a little bit more of a random, smaller flaked paint, chipped paint around some of the more heavily damaged areas. And this will allow a little bit more, I'm not quite sure what the right word would be, but just a little bit more randomness to the damage patterns, as opposed to the very strategic locations that I did with the toothpick. And it allowed me to go heavier in certain areas, like around the right waist area, which received extensive damage, around the area in the radio room, which received extensive damage, versus just like a regular machine gun bullet hit, which would have just punched a hole and flaked a little bit of paint off around the edges. So at this point now, all the liquid mask is done, and I'm going to go back and cover everything in a nice thin coat of black paint, just to kind of bring everything even again, so that I can go through the next steps of the painting process. And that's going to start with a pre-shading process here. Now, on an aircraft this large, this was a very painful process. This really gave me some good hand cramps. And because it requires a lot of control, a lot of precision, a lot of keeping your hand essentially locked in one position to do this. But something that I knew that I wanted to do, and I knew that it would work for the vision that I was going for. So again, this was something that this is one of those things where it's like, I don't want to extend this out over multiple evenings. This was just like, I'm going to sit down for 2.5 hours and just knock this out. Cause it's not just the fuselage. You have to do the wings and the horizontal stabilizers, and a lot of work. But with that done, we can go ahead and start laying down our actual colors here. So for the underside, using this dark gold gray, so normally these would have been painted a neutral gray on the underneath, but I find that a lot of the paint manufacturers tend to have their neutral gray be really more dark than looks right to me. So I like this dark gold gray as a slightly lighter variant, option to your typical neutral gray color. And I think this just looks a little bit better. And I've used this paint combination on the P40 that I did not too long ago. And, and essentially the P40 was a good like test drive for this paint combination. I'm really pleased with it. I ended up using it on another build that I did during this time as well. another P51, which you'll see on the channel later. And it's pretty much going to be my go-to when it comes to olive drab over neutral gray paint schemes. Now for the olive drab portion, I'm using a very familiar paint for me. This is the Ammo MIG olive drab series of paints. They have about 6 different olive drab variations. This one is called olive drab base, and this is kind of just your standard olive drab color. And this is a good place to start and allow you to build up different variations to this paint, and what could otherwise be a really boring paint job. This giant aircraft all painted olive drab, it can be pretty boring. But with the different paint versions they have of this, you can have a lot of fun doing some variations, and so you'll see a little bit of that later on. But this is going on relatively thin. We still want some of that pre-shading to show up and to show through, and give us some nice little tonal variation. So here's kind of the overall model, kind of put together just to kind of see how everything's matching up and blending together. Did I match the correct thickness and tone from the wings to the fuselage, that kind of thing. And now we're going to work with this one here. It's called Olive Drab Highlights. And this is a lightened version of the Olive Drab base. And I'm going to use this for all of the fabric control, covered control surfaces. The control surfaces that were fabric color, it would have accepted when it was painted, the paint would react differently to the fabric than it would to like the metal, for example, and it would fade and wear differently than the metal would. So I'm doing all of the control surfaces in this olive drab highlight color, and you can see it's significantly lighter with a little bit more yellow in it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to thin it down a little bit and start doing a little bit of like selective highlighting around the aircraft, mainly around areas where the ground crew would be working on the aircraft. And so the center portion of the wing here is where all of the fuel tanks were. So they would have had ground crew up there walking around, filling up the fuel tanks, things like that. Did a little bit of wear on the engine nacelles where ground crew would have been doing maintenance there. And then I did a little bit across the upper portion of the fuselage, just additional sun fading, trying not to go super heavy with it, again because this was a fairly new aircraft and hadn't seen extensive combat. Now next one you're using is Olive Drab Dark. This is a much darker, more green version of Olive Drab, and if you notice on a lot of old pictures of B-17Fs, you'll notice that a good portion of the vertical fin is a slightly different, usually darker version of olive drab from the rest of the aircraft. And that's because, as I understand it, this portion of the vertical fin was actually built and painted at a separate location and then shipped to the Boeing factory and assembled onto the rest of the aircraft. And so the paints didn't always match up. And I thought that was a neat little detail and would create a fun little variation to the overall paint scheme. Next up, we're doing all of the de-icing boots. Now you'll notice in many versions of the B-17 that they actually ended up removing the de-icing boots on some of them, and they would be left with this like nice shiny aluminum underneath. From all the contemporary pictures that I could see of other B-17s from this bomb group, they still had their de-icing boots at least during December of 1943. So they are painted that way. You do actually have to make a modification to the kit because the kit wants you to portray them as having no de-icing boots on there. There's exposed rivets. You have to fill the rivets in because the de-icing boots were just basically rubber and you wouldn't see rivets. So just be aware. And now we're going to move on to painting markings. And again, I'm returning to kit mask, just like I did with the Franz Stigler 109. We're going to be painting as many of the markings as we possibly can on here. And that's because I knew that there were going to be markings that were going to be covering areas of the aircraft that were going to be damaged. And just from my previous experience, I knew it was just going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to really get the decals to snuggle down over jagged, torn pieces of plastic. And it was just, I knew it was not going to give me the look that I wanted. And I decided to turn to Kit Mask, who very graciously helped me out with this and set up this masking set for me so that I could, realize the vision that I wanted. And I hope you'll see a little bit later on, once I start removing the mask and I start removing all of the liquid mask over the damaged areas, just how effective the painted markings are going to look compared to what they could have done if they were decal. So we get all the emblems, the stencils on there. We're going to start painting. And another nice thing about painting markings, it allows you to build in some, weathering and wear to the markings as well, which is something that's hard to do with decals. So, kind of a nice bonus there. So we're going to start with a base of white. A lot of the markings are going to start with white, and I have to do the markings in multiple layers. Otherwise, the stencils would overlap each other, and it just wouldn't work out very well. So next up, we're using Signal Blue on the national insignia here. This takes a couple of coats to get it like to that nice, rich, dark blue for the national insignia. And you'll notice on, I think it's actually this side of the fuselage, that there's a couple areas where I don't quite get it as nice and even as I should have, but in the end, I got it close enough. So removing the masking here was so incredibly satisfying. Like, one of the most satisfying masking pulls I've done in a long time. And you can start to see around some of the damaged areas where you can see some of that exposed aluminum color where my stencils pulled that up. At this point, that's okay. I can deal with that. It's not a big problem, but it kind of gives you a little glimpse preview into what we're expecting here. And so we're going to hit some of the markings here with just straight black, as opposed to like what I would normally use, which would have been NATO black. I wanted it to have a contrast against the black of like the de-icing boots and things like that. Now we're going to do squadron codes. I'm not going to say definitively that they were 100% painted gray. I think there's argument could be made that they could have possibly been painted yellow. I'm not an expert, so I'm just going off of, kind of what the research other people have done, and I'm good with that. So do the aircraft number here, the bureau number on the tail. Again, this was kind of tricky because I had to do these numbers over damaged areas, and that kind of screwed up the alignment a little bit, but in the end I got there. So now we can do the really fun reveal part, and that's removing all the liquid mask. So I'm using this really dense rubber that I picked up at a arts and crafts store that's meant for removing liquid mask. So the rubber really grabs onto the liquid mask, which is also kind of like a rubber-like material, and just pulls it right off. And you can start to see that beautiful aluminum showing through, and just that nice, like, bright, shiny metal underneath the paint. And yeah, this was really exciting, starting this process and really seeing all this damage, starting to expose itself. And it was at this point in the process, like, I'd gotten the paint down, things were finally coming together for me, and this was a point in the project where I was probably the most excited about everything. Like, I was finally starting to realize, okay, this is this is turning out how I imagined it in my head. And from this point on, the build went really fast. I was like, I'm not going to work on anything else until I get this done, because now I was finally really having a fun experience with this. So this type of weathering, damage and exposing the metal, really kind of activates those neurons in my brain, because it's, this is true in sense that, like, I'm exposing paint, a color underneath other paint, just how it would have been on the real thing. And yeah, just very satisfying, very fun. And it was almost like ooh, what do I get to reveal next? What cool damage is it going to show when I reveal the next thing? So at this point, we're going to go ahead and seal in all of this work that we've done with a nice, good, solid gloss coat. In fact, I actually ended up doing 2 layers on here. I didn't want to take any chances and make sure that this was all nice and varnished and taken care of so that we could do all the rest of our work on top of it, seal all this in, and again, this was a really fun part of the process. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to my father once again, and he's going to kind of take us through the entire mission that Ye Olde Pub had on that December 1943 day.
The encounter of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown. I want to take you back to the skies over Europe in the winter of 1943. It was a world at war, a world where mercy was scarce and survival was never guaranteed. In that setting, on December 20th, 1943, something extraordinary happened. Something so unlikely, so deeply human, that it has been remembered as one of the great stories of honor in modern warfare. It is the story of two young men, enemies by uniform, brought together in a moment of choice. Franz Stigler, a German fighter ace, and Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old American pilot flying his very first mission. That morning, Charlie Brown and his crew of 10 climbed into their B-17 Flying Fortress, a bomber they had nicknamed Ye Olde Pub. Their target was Bremen, a heavily defended industrial city in northern Germany. This was Charlie's first combat mission. He was nervous but determined. Like every crew, they were briefed, loaded with bombs, and launched into the gray skies of occupied Europe. But almost as soon as they reached their target, disaster struck. German flak, those black puffs of exploding anti-aircraft fire, tore into the formation. Charlie's plane was hit again and again. One engine was knocked out. The nose of the bomber was smashed open. A cannon shell ripped through the cockpit, nearly killing Charlie and his co-pilot. Blood ran down their faces from shrapnel. Still he pressed on. Ye Olde Pub dropped its bombs on Bremen. But the damage was catastrophic. Struggling behind the formation, the bomber became a sitting duck for German fighters. One after another, Messerschmitts tore through the crippled plane. The tail gunner was killed instantly. The rest of the crew were wounded, some gravely. Holes opened in the fuselage so wide that you could see daylight straight through the aircraft. The oxygen system failed. One engine was on fire. By all logic, the B-17 should have fallen from the sky, but somehow, through determination and sheer luck, Charlie kept her flying. Limping along at barely 200 miles an hour, dropping altitude fast, he turned west, hoping against hope to reach England. Meanwhile, on the ground, a German pilot was climbing into his fighter. His name was Franz Stigler. Franz was an experienced ace, credited for dozens of kills. He had flown in North Africa and had seen more than his share of combat. By 1943, he was back in Germany, tasked with intercepting Allied bombers. That afternoon, he took off in his Messerschmitt 109. As he scanned the sky, he spotted something unusual, a lone B-17 limping along, far behind the formation. For a fighter pilot, this was an easy prey. A straggler like that was practically a gift. One short burst from the cannon, and it would be all over. Franz pushed the throttle and closed in. As he approached, Franz prepared to fire, but then he looked more closely. The bomber was destroyed, its nose blown open, its tail barely hanging on, its engines failing, and through the holes in the fuselage, Hans could see the men inside. They were not manning their guns. They were slumped over, bleeding, tending to one another. He saw blood on the floor, faces pale, hands trembling. These men weren't fighting, they were dying. Franz later said to shoot them down would have been murder. In that moment of his training, his orders and his conscience collided. He knew that if he fired, no one would ever question it. In fact, if he downed the bomber, it would complete a tally he needed to earn the King's Cross, one of Germany's highest honors. But Franz could not do it. His Catholic upbringing, his family's refusal to join the Nazi Party, and the lessons he had learned in North Africa, you fight by the rules of honor, you don't kill defenseless men, all came rushing back. He took his finger off the trigger. Instead of destroying the bomber, Franz pulled up alongside of it. He flew wingtip to wingtip with Charlie Brown. Imagine Charlie's terror. Sitting in a shattered cockpit, blood running down his face, engines failing, when suddenly a German fighter appears right beside him. He was certain that this was the end. But instead of firing, Franz gestured. He pointed down, signaling Charlie to land in Germany. Surrender, he was saying. You'll survive. But Charlie refused. He kept flying west, towards the North Sea. Franz realized that what Charlie intended, he was trying to make it home, across the sea, back to England. So Franz made another remarkable decision. He stayed with the bomber. Flying so close the American crew could see the rivets on his fighter, Franz escorted Ye Olde Pub towards the coast. His presence confused the German flank batteries below. Seeing a Messerschmitt flying beside a bomber, many of them held their fire, thinking it was a German plane turning to base. Together, German fighter and American bomber flew in silence. No shots were fired, just two enemies, side by side, in a brief truce of mercy. When they reached the edge of the North Sea, Franz knew he could go no further. If he continued, he risked being shot down by the Allies. So he pulled up alongside the cockpit one last time. Charlie turned his head and saw the German pilot clearly for the first time. And Franz did something simple but unforgettable. He looked across the gap, raised his hand, and gave a salute. Then he peeled away, banked his Messerschmitt, and turned back towards Germany. Charlie Brown and his battered crew flew on, across the cold waters of the North Sea, somehow making it back to England. Against all odds, they survived. Charlie reported what had happened, but at first few believed him. Who would believe that a German ace had spared a crippled bomber, had even escorted it to safety? Franz, for his part, told no one. To have spared the enemy was dangerous. Had his superiors known, he could have faced court-martial, even execution. So he kept it secret. For decades, the story lived only in the memories of the men who had been there. Nearly 50 years later, Charlie Brown, now retired, living in the United States, set out to find the German pilot who spared him. Through research, veteran networks, and a bit of luck, he finally tracked down Franz Stigler, who by then was living in Canada. When they met, Charlie embraced Franz and said, "You saved my life." And Franz replied, "I didn't spare you. I spared my conscience." The two men became friends, almost like brothers. They would often appear together at reunions and events, telling their story, not as enemies, but as men bound forever by a moment of shared humanity. Their friendship lasted the rest of their lives. What do we make of this encounter? War is cruel. It strips away compassion. It teaches men to hate, to dehumanize, to kill without hesitation. And yet, in the middle of the bloodiest conflict the war had ever known, one man chose differently. Franz Stigler could have taken the shot. He could have earned glory, medals, recognition. Instead, he chose mercy. He chose not to see uniforms, but men. He chose humanity over hate. And Charlie Brown, bleeding, terrified, yet determined, chose to lead his crew to keep flying, and to never give up. Together, they remind us that even in the darkest time, the light of honor and compassion can shine through. On December 20th, 1943, high over Germany, a German fighter pilot and an American bomber crew met as enemies. They parted as something far greater. Not long after Franz Stigler reflected on that day, he said, "I couldn't have shot them. I would have shot myself instead." That is the legacy of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, a reminder that even in war, our choices matter, that mercy is possible, and humanity can endure, and that sometimes the greatest victory is not destruction, but the decision to spare life.
After reading A Higher Call, it was kind of that concept, that idea that really pushed me to want to do this project. And while I don't necessarily have a deep personal connection to this project, I'm not like related to any of these people, I knew that this was a poignant moment that I wanted to try and capture. And it kind of evolved into something that was personal to me, just through the and I apologize, this is hard to put into words for me. I think about it often, but I don't often verbalize it. But being able to kind of see like the good in humanity, and I think now more than ever, when times feel tough and seems like darkness is around us, that we need these moments to be able to reflect on the good that people can do. And so, yeah, I think I echo what my father has said, and that, this is a poignant story and a reminder for us. So moving on with the build, I'm painting the engines right now, and these are 3D printed engines from a matter of scale. And the detail on these engines is just absolutely exceptional. A matter of scale also did all of the machine guns for the build as well, and so I'm hugely grateful to Matter of Scale for sending this out to me and allowing me to put this on the project, because this is a huge improvement over the kit parts, and you can just see all the lovely detail, the ignition wires, that everything is represented here, and unfortunately my painting does not do these 3D prints justice, but I'm trying the best I can here. And I mean, you could spend a long time painting up these engines. And fortunately, one of the nice things about radial engines, if you've watched this channel long enough and you've seen enough of my build videos, you'll know that I'm a really big fan of radial engines. Just for one, like, they're cool looking, they sound fantastic, but as in the world of scale modeling, they're great because it's a little bit of that exposed mechanics and engineering on a model that you get to represent. And many kits will kind of, I don't really want to say dumb down the detail, but really, simplify the detail of a radial engine. And a radial engine is an extremely complex piece of machinery. There's a lot going on. And I've done a lot over the years to try and create my own details, but having these 3D prints out of the box as a drop-in replacement is just like, it's so nice, it's so easy, and it's a huge improvement over the kit parts. For the exhaust on this aircraft, I wanted to try something slightly different, and with how I painted and prepared them. So I experimented, played around, and I came up with this pretty straightforward and simple method. So I painted the exhaust aluminum, And then I'm applying Parasite Brown and this kind of leather brown as two wet coats. Like I'm blending these colors together. They're going wet over wet. They're kind of thin. I want some of that metallic showing through. And then once they dry, and sorry, I should apologize. I didn't put any kind of like clear varnish over the metallic paint, so it's just metallic paint and then the acrylic paint, and now I'm doing this enamel wash. And what I found that the acrylic paint actually didn't fully adhere to the nice smooth metallic paint. So as I'm removing the excess wash here, it also exposed some of that bare aluminum paint underneath, and I very very happy with the results here. So this is the exhaust system, and the exhaust would come off of the engine, go into the turbochargers. The turbochargers would help increase air volume into the engine, therefore allowing them to create more horsepower up high altitude. And this system would get very hot, and it would distort the metal and discolor the metal. So that's the effect that I was going for, and I was again very pleased, very happy with how that turned out. And another thing I wanted to talk about really quickly was just the weathering and staining I added to the top of the wings. I really tried hard not to like ever criticize other modelers, but some modelers get it wrong. There's these vents that sit behind the engines on the top of the wings. Those are vents for like the oil coolers and the intercoolers for the radiator, for the engines. They're not actual exhaust vents. And so many modelers will depict like brown soot coming out of those vents, and that is technically not correct. What you will see is oil streaming off of the engine and actually going in between those vents, because there would be a lot of hot air coming out of those vents from the radiators, from the intercoolers, that would actually blow off any kind of debris or soot from the engines. And so just to point it out. Now, that's not like a hard and fast rule. There's always exceptions. I'm sure someone's going to be able to point to a photographic evidence saying, no, that's not correct. But in generally, that is how it worked. At this point, all the weathering's done, and this is really just kind of like the final assembly moment, adding all these tiny little details to the project to really help bring it alive. And one of the things I wanted to do here was, so the right waist gun was essentially blown out of the aircraft. It was completely sheared off of its mount, and I kind of wanted to have the ammo chute like trailing out the aircraft, as if it, like the gun had been ripped from its mount and pulled the ammo chute out and it was slapping against the side of the fuselage. I just thought that would be kind of a neat moment to help show a little bit of dynamic, motion to the model. There's these little air deflectors that kind of pop out when the windows are open for the gunner positions. I'd originally had them on the build earlier on during the painting process, but I managed to knock them off. So that was just me putting them back on, getting the radio room gun installed. The radio room gun was a neat little like model unto itself, and there was many different mounts for this gun on the different versions of the B-17. So you'll have to do your research on if you're building it, how it was mounted. But again, contemporary, it looked like that was how it was mounted. Tail guns going on. I do a little bit of work here off camera to kind of emphasize the violence in the tail section here. You'll see it in the final, the final reveal of the model. I chose not to depict that as a work in progress part, but just be aware that there was some additional gore that had to be added there. Antenna going on, left waist gun going in. Again, this is the matter of scale guns with the master brass barrels. Fantastic combination. Top turret going in. The top turret was technically the only gun system that was working on Ye Olde Pub, but in fear of essentially being shot down, they didn't actually use the turret. But for a portion of the flight information with Franz Stigler, the top turret gunner was in the turret, just didn't have the turret pointed at the 109. But I do have the figure in there looking at the 109, kind of keep an eye on him. One nice thing about the HK kit is the fact that the wings have this slot, and it's a very secure like slotting method to install them, which is nice because it allows me to remove the wings so I can transport this if I need to take it to a show or whatever. And it makes it very convenient to move it around. Adding all the details to the nose section, we get the cheek guns going in, the Norden bomb sight going in, and then we can install the very nose gun. So we insert the barrel first, and then we're going to insert the barrel into the actual gun breech. And I've already attached the ammo chute and the ammo can to the gun, and so we can just kind of slot that all in there as a whole unit. Again, the photo etch ammo belts really help add a lot to the busy and claustrophobic nature of these B-17s, and trying to imagine there's another guy that would have been in there, all these guns, ammo everywhere. It just would have been chaotic at best to be in this thing. Pitot tubes going on. I couldn't really tell if they would have been painted the upper surface color or the lower surface color. I ended up choosing the upper surface color. Don't know if that's 100% accurate or correct, but looked good to me. Next up is the radio antennas. Now, I kind of inadvertently caused myself a little bit of an issue here with how I modeled the damage in the radio room, because the panel that's peeled back actually had one of the attachment points for one of the radio antennas. And so I had to try and figure out, okay, how am I going to do this? And I just kind of realized, well, it would be interesting to have the radio antenna on the right side, pulled taut, but then have the radio antenna on the left side slack, because that portion of the fuselage has been peeled away. And then, in my mind, it was like the radio antenna didn't get severed, but it's no longer under tension because that panel is pulled back, and it would be kind of interesting to have that as something loose. But then I realized I also needed to have the inside portion of that, and so I decided to have that portion severed and kind of blowing it back against, along the flow of the airflow. Interesting little detail, but yeah. All right, so I've been getting a lot of questions in my previous videos about, Brett, how did you do the propellers? And this was something that I had to think about, how I wanted to portray this. If you've watched my C-47 dual build, I built one of those in flight, and I used some photo etch prop blur effect for that, and it looked okay, but I wasn't 100% satisfied with it, because it was just one dimensional, just a flat thin disc. I wanted something that was three-dimensional, that really gave you the impression that these were propellers moving through the air. And I reached out to my friend Andy. He goes by the handle Mr. Plamo on Instagram and YouTube, and he's been practicing his 3D modeling skills. And so I put out a challenge to him. I was like, hey, do you think you could come up with an idea to do a 3D printed prop blur effect? And he was like, yeah, let's do this. And originally I was just going to have it printed in gray resin, and then he suggested, well, what if we do it clear? And it was it broke my brain. That's such a genius idea, because as you can see here, I can paint the actual propeller part of it and kind of fade out the color, but have the rest of it clear. And I was so thrilled at what he came up with here, and these are actually prototypes, and he plans on selling these on his website, and I'll leave a link down below. He's refined the design a little bit, cleaned it up a little bit more. So I'm kind of proud to say that I've got kind of a one-of-a-kind thing here. And but nevertheless, so thrilled that my vision and his 3D modeling skills combined to bring this to pass. And because this is exactly what I was looking for in terms of portraying motion without it being, just a simple flat plane. And he was also kind enough to do the 109 propeller as well. So now I have spinning propellers for the pub. Like I mentioned before, the number 2 engine was shut down, so it doesn't get a prop blur effect. I used the kit propeller, cut the blades off, repositioned them to show that as being feathered, and then there we go. So the final thing to do is bring it all together. I had contemplated many different ideas. I looked at other people's builds of this project and what they did. And some people did like a map, some people did, the French countryside and clouds, and some people did other things. And I realized that I wanted something that was just really simple, really clean, so that the viewer could be focusing on the story being told here with the aircraft. And so to that end, I got a essentially 24-inch by 18-inch sheet of quarter-inch black acrylic. And that was just going to be, and that was going to be it. That was going to be my display. It was going to be really simple. I didn't want anything to distract from the story that I wanted to tell. And I've not really worked with acrylic all that much. And so I was a little hesitant. I mean, this wasn't necessarily a cheap piece of acrylic. It was rather large. And so I was a little hesitant to like start drilling into it, but I knew that there really wasn't any other way. So I got a brand new drill bit. I wanted to make sure it was as sharp as possible so that I could make a clean cut into this acrylic. And fortunately, it worked out. It chipped a little bit on the underside, but I drilled from the top down, so there was no chipping on the top side of it. And then using some spray adhesive and some craft foam, I added these little pads on the bottom so that wherever I transport it, move it, it's not going to be sitting directly onto the acrylic, which could scratch it or cause problems. It would have this nice soft pad to sit on. And then finally, it was time to insert the rods that would carry both aircraft. These were super glued into place. And I had to play around with how high I wanted them. There was a very specific image that I was trying to portray. Once those were in, it was just a matter of removing all the paper. And again, a very satisfying process here. And I knew as soon as I would take this paper off that it would instantly get dirty and dusty, and it'd be a constant battle to keep it from looking dirty. But I also got a little plaque made on Amazon, and with just a little bit of self-adhesive tape, this goes right on. And with that, we can start putting our aircraft on, and that will complete the display. So 8 months worth of work, all culminating here. Now, before we move on to the final reveal, I do need to acknowledge a few people here that helped with this project, who were instrumental with this project. So I hope you'll bear with me just for a few moments. First and foremost, I want to thank my patrons for supporting this channel, but also being a sounding board for me as I went through this process and listening to all of my frustrations, my roadblocks, and helping me work through those. I want to acknowledge Kevin and Janelle from kitmask.com. They're always willing to help me out with a project, and they are fantastic individuals, people, human beings, and I cannot speak highly enough about them. I want to thank Matters of Scale for their involvement with the project and for helping me to maximize the detail I can get out of this project with both the engines and all of the armament for the aircraft. I want to thank Andy from Mr. Plamo for helping me get these 3D printed propellers done, so that that was kind of the final piece of the puzzle to really bring this all together and to finalize my vision. And then finally, I want to thank Getz Minis for providing some of their black magic metal, which really helped to accurately portray the damage that I wanted to show. Well, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for supporting this project. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you know that this project meant a lot to me personally. And this was 8 months of blood, sweat, and tears, literally, to bring this together. And I'm just grateful to be able to share it with you. Hopefully some of you who didn't know about this story before will now know and will go read the book, go learn the story. And like I said at the beginning of the video, if you make it this far, I've got a neat little teaser here, or a neat little bit of bonus footage here at the end. So thank you for watching. Catch you on the next video, and enjoy the bonus footage.
Good miniature right there.